I had been planning this hike for months, watching the weather reports, studying the maps, and gathering all the gear I thought I would need. It was supposed to be a simple 2-day trip through a stretch of forest known for its rugged terrain and natural beauty. I was eager to escape the city, the noise, and the endless flood of messages on my phone. I wanted to lose myself in the woods, to find silence and peace. The morning I left, the air was crisp but not cold. The sun was just rising, casting a soft orange glow through the thin morning mist that still clung to the trees. I packed the last of my things into my backpack: water, some snacks, a map, compass, first aid kit, extra clothes, and my tent. I made sure my boots were tied tight and my jacket was zipped up. I took a deep breath of the fresh air and stepped onto the trail. The path was narrow and winding, carved through thick clusters of pine and fir trees. The ground beneath my boots was soft with pine needles and patches of moss. Every so often, I could hear the faint rustle of leaves as small animals moved in the underbrush. Birds called to one another high above, their voices echoing through the branches. It felt like the forest was alive with quiet energy. At first, the hike was easy. The trail followed a gentle slope, and I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the calmness. I stopped a few times to take pictures of the wildflowers and a small creek that trickled alongside the path. I drank some water, wiped the sweat from my brow, and kept going. The sun rose higher, filtering through the canopy and warming the air. After about 3 hours, the trail started to climb more steeply. The trees thinned out, and the ground became rockier. I had to watch my footing carefully. The forest was less dense here, opening up to patches of scrub and scattered boulders. From the vantage point, I could see the valley below, the river glinting in the sunlight, the distant ridges fading into the haze. I paused to rest on a large rock, catching my breath. The quietness pressed in around me. No other hikers had passed by. I hadn't seen a soul since I started. Part of me felt comforted by the solitude, but another part was growing uneasy. The silence seemed too complete, almost unnatural. I shook the feeling off and pressed forward. The trail twisted sharply, and soon I reached a junction. According to my map, I was supposed to take the left fork. The path was less clear here, more overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. I pulled out my compass to double-check the direction. The needle pointed where it should. As I moved down the left path, the forest grew denser again, darker with thicker foliage blocking out most of the sunlight. The ground was damp, and I could smell the strong, earthy scent of wet leaves and decaying wood. Every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in around me. I heard a distant sound, maybe the rush of water, but I wasn't sure. It was muffled, like a secret hidden deep in the trees. I kept walking, focusing on the trail markers I had been following. But after about an hour, I began to notice something odd. The markers were becoming less frequent, some faded or broken. The trail was less clear, and I stumbled over roots and rocks more often. My heart rate quickened. I stopped and pulled out my map, comparing it to the landscape around me. The trees looked familiar, but the map didn't match perfectly. I realized I might have taken a wrong turn. Panic flickered briefly, but I forced myself to stay calm. I tried to retrace my steps to the last marker I was certain of. I walked back slowly, scanning every tree for the small colored ribbons tied to branches or scratched symbols on the bark. After some time, I found a marker and felt a bit of relief. But then I noticed something that chilled me. There was another marker tied to a tree a few feet away, but it looked different. The ribbon was old and faded, the colors barely visible. The symbol scratched in the bark was unfamiliar to me. It looked like a crude circle with strange lines crossing it. I hesitated. Maybe it was just another trail marker, but something about it felt wrong. I decided to keep following the original trail, ignoring this strange symbol. As I walked, the forest grew quieter. The birds stopped singing. Even the rustling of small animals seemed to vanish. I pressed on, trying to keep my mind steady. The light was fading. The sun was sinking behind the hills. I knew I had to find a campsite soon. I looked for a clearing, a flat spot where I could set up my tent before dark. After another half hour, I found a small clearing with soft grass and a few fallen logs. It wasn't the perfect campsite, but it would have to do. I set up my tent quickly, working with shaking hands. The forest around me felt thick and watchful, like eyes hidden behind every tree. I built a small fire, the flames crackling and giving off warm light. I ate some trail mix and drank water, trying to steady my breathing. The sounds of the forest returned with the darkness. An owl hooted somewhere far away. Insects buzzed near the firelight. But underneath it all, there was an uneasy silence, a stillness that felt unnatural. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the fire pop and snap. My mind raced with questions. Was I lost? Had I wandered off the trail too far? Should I stay put or try to find my way back in the dark? I decided to wait until morning. In the night, strange noises came from the woods. A distant crunch of footsteps, the snap of a twig. My heart pounded every time. I tried to remind myself that I was alone and safe, but sleep didn't come easy. When dawn broke, I packed up quickly and started walking, hoping to find the main trail again. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. I moved carefully, scanning for markers or signs. After hours of walking, I came to a stream not marked on my map. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a known trail. The forest was dense, and the ground slippery from the morning dew. I slipped several times, catching myself on branches. Suddenly, I heard voices far off in the distance. Relief washed over me. I moved toward the sound, thinking I had finally found other hikers or maybe a ranger station. But as I got closer, the voices stopped. The forest grew silent again. I pushed forward, feeling more alone than ever. I realized I had no idea where I was. Then I noticed something else. Footprints in the mud along the stream bank. They were large, heavy prints, and they didn't look like mine. They headed upstream, away from the direction I was moving. I hesitated. Following the footprints could be dangerous, but ignoring them might mean missing a chance to find someone else. I debated what to do, but then heard a low growl close by. My heart jumped. I stopped and scanned the underbrush. A large bear emerged a few meters away, blocking the path. Its eyes locked on me, muscles tense, nostrils flaring. I froze. I remembered everything I had read about bear encounters. Stay calm, don't run, slowly back away. My hands trembled, and my breath came fast. The bear growled again and took a step toward me. I slowly raised my arms to make myself look bigger, hoping to intimidate it. It hesitated, sniffed the air, then turned and lumbered away into the trees. My legs felt weak. I sat down heavily and tried to calm down. The encounter had shaken me deeply. After resting, I started walking again, this time following the stream downstream. Hours passed, and the forest slowly began to thin. The terrain leveled out into a meadow, and in the distance I could see a dirt road. I ran toward it, relief flooding through me. I found a ranger's truck parked by the roadside, and soon after, a park ranger arrived. I told him where I had been, how I got lost, and about the bear encounter. The ranger shook his head, explaining how dangerous that part of the forest could be. Many hikers had lost their way there before. He gave me water, food, and a ride back to the trailhead. That night, safe in a small motel with a hot shower and a warm bed, I thought about the forest. It wasn't full of ghosts or fairy tales, but it was dangerous. It demanded respect, careful planning, and caution. I learned that the wilderness could swallow you whole if you weren't prepared, and sometimes the scariest things are real, silent threats, like being lost in the vastness of nature or facing a wild animal that doesn't want to share its home. I had planned this hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, a way to clear my head after months of stress at work. The trail was well known, but long, about 15 miles round trip, winding through dense forest and up steep ridges. I packed light but smart water, some energy bars, a first aid kit, my phone, and a map. The weather forecast was clear, with just a slight chance of afternoon clouds. I left early, just as the sun was coming up. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the sharp scent of pine and wet earth. I loved that smell, It reminded me of childhood camping trips. My boots crunched softly on the dry leaves and small stones as I made my way uphill. Birds sang in the trees, and the occasional rustle hinted at squirrels or rabbits nearby. The path was narrow, winding, with tall trees shading the ground. The forest felt alive but peaceful. After about 2 hours, I stopped by a small creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I filled my bottle and sat on a mossy rock to rest. The sound of the creek and the quiet forest around me was calming. I ate some trail mix and checked my map. I was about a third of the way up the trail, still feeling strong. The sun rose higher and warmed the air. I packed up and continued. The path became steeper, the trees thinner, and the view started to open up. I could see the valley below, a patchwork of green fields and silver rivers glinting in the sunlight. It was beautiful, the kind of scene that makes you stop and catch your breath, not just because of the climb, but because it feels like a reward. As I hiked, I kept an eye on the sky. The clouds were gathering slowly, soft gray shapes drifting in from the west. The forecast had mentioned a slight chance of rain, but I thought I could beat it. The trail was well marked, with small painted blazes on trees and rocks, so I wasn't worried about losing my way. About 4 hours in, I reached the top of the ridge. The wind was stronger here, cold and sharp against my face. The view was stunning, mountains rolling out in every direction, their peaks capped with snow even in late spring. I took out my camera and snapped some pictures, trying to capture the moment. I drank some water, then pulled out my map again to plan my route back. That's when things started to feel off. I noticed the clouds were much thicker now, dark gray and moving fast. The wind had picked up too, bending the trees and sending dry leaves swirling in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, making me zip up my jacket. I started my descent, keeping a steady pace. The trail was steeper on this side, with loose rocks and wet patches from recent rain. The forest here was thicker, with tangled undergrowth crowding the edges of the path. I was careful with every step. After about an hour, the first raindrops began to fall, small and sparse at first, but growing steadily heavier. The forest canopy offered some shelter, but the wind blew the rain at odd angles, soaking my jacket and making the path slippery. I kept moving, my eyes scanning ahead for the next marker. Then, I noticed something strange. The painted blazes were getting harder to find. The trail seemed less clear. I stopped and looked around. The trees here were closer together, and the underbrush thicker. The path narrowed to just a faint line through the leaves. I checked my map and phone GPS. The signal was weak but still working. According to the GPS, I was still on the trail, but the surroundings didn't match the map's landmarks. I felt a chill that wasn't just from the rain. I pressed on, but the trail soon disappeared entirely beneath a fallen tree. I scrambled over the trunk and tried to find the path on the other side. Nothing, just dense bushes and uneven ground. My heart started to beat faster. I backtracked, hoping to find a clearer section. Then I realized something worse. I had lost the trail. The forest here was quiet except for the rain tapping on leaves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. I tried to stay calm. I sat down on a wet rock and took a deep breath. My phone showed my location, but the battery was only half full and the signal was weak. If I didn't find the trail soon, I would run out of power. I thought back to my training and advice I had read about wilderness survival. The key was to stay put if lost, conserve energy, and try to signal for help. But I was cold, wet, and hungry. The rain was heavier now, drenching me through my jacket. I decided to keep moving downhill, reasoning that the trailhead and parking lot must be at lower elevation. I followed a small stream, hoping it would lead to the main path or road. The ground was slippery and uneven, with mud and wet rocks. Every step required concentration. The forest grew darker as the day wore on. The rain made everything look gray and shadowy. I passed broken branches and animal tracks, deer and raccoon prints mostly. I kept listening for sounds of other hikers or cars, but there was only the rain and the occasional bird call. Hours passed. I realized I hadn't seen any sign of the trail or other people for a long time. My phone's battery was down to 15%. I sat on a log, soaked and shivering, and ate the last of my trail mix. My fingers were numb, and I had trouble opening my water bottle. I debated what to do next. I could stay put and hope someone would find me, but there was no way for anyone to know where I was. The park rangers would probably start a search in the morning if I didn't return, but that was many hours away. I decided to keep following the stream. Water often leads to roads or campsites. Maybe I could find a ranger station or a clearing with better signal. Night started to fall. The forest became a black mass around me. I pulled out my flashlight, but the batteries were weak and flickered. The rain stopped suddenly, leaving the air cold and still. I felt exposed, alone, vulnerable. I pressed on carefully. The stream turned into a small river, wider and faster. The banks were steep and muddy. I had to climb up and down slippery slopes. My boots were heavy with mud, my clothes soaked through. Then I heard it, a low noise, faint but distinct. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, coming from the trees across the river. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or bear, but the footsteps were too loud, deliberate, like someone walking carefully but steadily. My heart pounded. I scanned the shadows with my flashlight, but saw nothing. I moved away from the riverbank and crouched behind a large rock. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving parallel to the river. I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, then faded. After a long moment, I decided to keep moving, faster now but careful not to slip. I walked until I saw a faint light in the distance. A cabin? A campfire? I didn't know. I moved toward it slowly, hoping for safety. As I got closer, I saw it was a small ranger cabin. The light was from a lantern inside. I knocked on the door, feeling relief wash over me. A ranger opened it, surprised but kind. I explained my situation with gestures and simple words. They gave me dry clothes, hot tea, and called for help. They said they had been worried about hikers caught in the storm and had started a search earlier that evening. I was safe now. The next morning, I was led back to the trailhead by a small search party. The forest looked calm and friendly in the daylight. I was tired, cold, and sore, but alive. I realized how easy it was to get lost and how fast the situation could turn dangerous in the wilderness. The experience changed me. I learned to respect nature's power and unpredictability. Now, every time I hike, I carry extra supplies, a compass, and a fully charged phone. I always tell someone where I'm going and when to expect me back. That day alone in the forest taught me the real meaning of fear and survival, and the importance of being prepared. It was early morning when I set off on the trail. The air was cool and fresh, still holding the crispness of dawn. I had planned this hike weeks ago, looking forward to the quiet and the chance to be alone in the woods for a day. My backpack was snug against my shoulders, carrying water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. The path ahead was clear, winding through tall pine trees that stretched up toward the pale blue sky. Birds called softly here and there, and the ground beneath my boots was firm but dotted with fallen leaves and small branches. First, everything felt peaceful. The trail followed a small creek, the water bubbling over smooth rocks. I could hear the steady rush of it, mixing with the rustling of the wind through the trees. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the quiet rhythm of my steps and the smell of pine and earth. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the canopy and warming the skin on my face. I paused a few times to take pictures of wildflowers or to watch a squirrel dart across the path. This was exactly what I needed. But as the day wore on, the trail began to change. The woods grew thicker, the trees older and closer together. The creek disappeared, replaced by steep rocky slopes covered in loose stones and dirt. The path became narrow, and the uneven ground forced me to watch every step carefully. My legs started to ache, and the pack on my back felt heavier with each mile. I knew I was heading toward a ridge I'd read about, a place with a view that was supposed to be worth the effort. Around mid-afternoon, the sun was high and strong. I found a spot on a large rock to rest and drink water. The quiet was deeper here, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a hawk. I looked up at the ridge, just a few hundred yards away, and felt a small surge of excitement. After that, I'd head back down the other side, completing the loop. I checked my map and compass, making sure I was still on the right route. Everything seemed fine. That's when I noticed the trail behind me, or rather, the lack of it. The path I had come from was covered in fresh debris. Branches broken, leaves scattered in a way I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought maybe the wind had shifted during the day, but the pattern didn't feel natural. The debris looked as if something or someone had pushed through it quickly. My heart rate quickened a bit, but I told myself to stay calm. I wasn't the first person on this trail, and animals could easily explain it. I packed up and started walking again toward the ridge. The ground grew steeper, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks. The view opened up gradually, and I could see the valley below, a patchwork of green and brown forests stretching out for miles. It was beautiful, but something felt off. The air had grown still. The wind that had been moving through the trees was gone, and the usual sounds of wildlife were almost silent. When I reached the top, I scanned the horizon. No clouds, just a wide, clear sky. I pulled out my phone to check the time and my GPS location. The signal was weak but stable. I was right where I expected to be. But then I noticed something more troubling. My backpack felt lighter than it should, and when I checked, one of my water bottles was missing. I hadn't taken it out, and I was sure I had packed it this morning. Panic didn't rise yet, but a cold feeling spread through me. I looked around carefully. No sign of the bottle anywhere. The ground was undisturbed except for my own footprints. No other tracks. I tried to tell myself that maybe I had dropped it without noticing, but that seemed unlikely. I was always careful about my gear. I sat on a rock and tried to think through what could have happened. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, a careless mistake, or maybe someone else on the trail. The thought of other people nearby made me uneasy. The trail was supposed to be quiet, not crowded. I scanned the ridge for any sign of movement but saw nothing. Then I heard it, a snap from behind me, a breaking branch somewhere down the slope. It was faint but sharp enough to cut through the silence. My head snapped in the direction of the sound. Nothing visible. I froze, heart pounding. It was just a small noise, but in that stillness it felt enormous. I stood up slowly, grabbed my pack, and decided to head back down the ridge. The sun was beginning to lean westward, and I wanted to make sure I had enough daylight to get back safely. But as I moved, I realized the trail was harder to follow. The rocks and dirt had shifted, and I couldn't clearly see the markers I had passed earlier. My steps slowed, and I became more alert. Another sound, this time, something low and heavy, like a footstep, but distant. I stopped and waited, straining to hear. Nothing else. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the feeling in my gut tightened. I looked back up the ridge, then down the path, but I was alone. The descent was slow and careful. My legs were tired, and the fading light made it harder to see. I tried to remember the landmarks. A twisted tree, a large boulder, a broken branch, but it felt like the forest was shifting around me. After what felt like hours, I reached a fork in the trail. I stopped and checked my map again. The fork wasn't supposed to be here. It was a path I didn't recognize. I debated which way to go, and finally chose the left fork because it seemed more worn. The forest thickened, and the undergrowth brushed against my legs. The sun slipped lower, and shadows grew long and dark. I reached for my flashlight, turning it on with a click, the beam cutting through the dusk. The path was narrow, overgrown in places. My pace slowed. The air smelled damp, like rain even though none was forecast. Then I heard the sound again, close this time. A branch snapping, a faint rustle just beyond the edge of the light. My breath hitched. I stopped and listened. The silence after was heavy, almost oppressive. I pushed on, the beam swinging from side to side. Every shadow seemed alive. The underbrush moved as if something was just out of sight. My fingers trembled slightly as I gripped the flashlight tighter. Suddenly, the beam caught a shape moving quickly between the trees. It was too fast to be a deer, too big for a rabbit. My heart jumped. I shone the light toward the movement, but it vanished before I could get a good look. The forest was silent again. I decided I couldn't stay on this path. I turned back toward the fork, but now the trail looked different, almost unfamiliar. The same trees stood in new positions, or so it seemed in the fading light. Panic began to grow. I tried calling for help on my phone, but no signal. The night was coming, and I was lost in the woods. I kept walking, hoping to find the main trail, hoping to find signs of the creek or the ridge. The forest closed in, the darkness thick around me. Every crackle of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The cold crept in too, seeping through my jacket. Eventually, I found a small clearing. I dropped my pack and sat on a rock, trying to calm myself. I drank some water and ate a bite of a granola bar. I told myself I could wait until morning if I had to. I had some matches and a small stove to make fire, but the fear was deep. I was alone, lost in a vast wilderness, and no one knew where I was. I tried to retrace my steps back to the fork, but the woods were too dark, too confusing. I had no choice but to stay put. I built a small fire using dry sticks and leaves and huddled close. The flames flickered, casting long shadows. I listened to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the trees. Hours passed. The fire died down. I lay back on the cold ground, my mind racing. I tried to remember all my survival training, how to stay calm, how to conserve energy, how to wait for rescue. Then, near dawn, I heard voices. Not loud, but clear enough to cut through the stillness. Relief flooded me. I shouted, waving my arms. The voices grew closer, and soon a search party emerged from the trees. They had been looking for me since I failed to check in. I was saved. I decided to take a solo hiking trip deep into the wilderness, something I had done a few times before, but never this far or this long. I had been planning the route for months, studying maps, reading trail reports, and preparing my gear carefully. I wanted to challenge myself with a long trek through a remote mountain range that few hikers visited. The area was known for its rough terrain, dense forests, and steep cliffs, but also for its beauty and solitude. The morning I set off, the sky was clear and cool, the kind of spring morning that promises a good day ahead. I was carrying my pack with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, first aid kit, and plenty of layers for changing weather. My boots were broken in, my backpack adjusted for comfort. I felt ready and confident. The first day was perfect. The trail wound through tall pine trees, past clear streams, and over mossy rocks. I saw small animals, chipmunks and birds, and the fresh smell of pine filled the air. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to eat or take photos. The sun was warm on my back but not hot. I camped near a small lake, pitched my tent, cooked dinner, and watched the stars come out in a dark sky free of city lights. It was peaceful. The second day was tougher. The trail climbed steeply up a ridge, and I had to stop often to catch my breath. The forest thinned out, and the wind was colder and stronger at the higher elevation. The trees gave way to rocks and scraggly bushes. I moved slowly but steadily, feeling the strain in my legs and lungs. I reached a small plateau just before sunset and set up camp again. The view was amazing, valleys stretching far below, the jagged peaks around me catching the last light of day. On the third day, things started to change. I woke to a cloudy sky and a chill in the air. The wind was stronger, and it ruffled the tent fabric loudly. I packed up quickly, eager to make progress before the weather got worse. The trail here was narrow, winding along the side of a steep cliff with loose gravel underfoot. I had to watch every step carefully. The higher I went, the colder and windier it became. By midday, the clouds thickened, and a light rain began to fall. The trail grew slippery and dangerous. I kept going but slowed down, gripping tree roots and rocks to keep steady. My boots were wet, and my fingers cold despite my gloves. I knew from the map that the trail would soon start to descend toward a river valley, and I hoped the rain would ease. But the rain didn't ease. Instead, It turned heavier and colder as the afternoon passed. The trail became a slick mud path, and the trees lost their sheltering effect. The wind howled between the trunks, and the sky darkened. I had to keep my head down to keep the rain out of my eyes. I reached the river valley late in the day, soaking wet and tired. The river was swollen from the rain, rushing fast over rocks and fallen trees. The trail ran close to the water here, but the banks were muddy and unstable. I found a flat spot above the river to set up my tent, but had to dig into the wet soil to anchor the stakes. Inside the tent, I changed into dry clothes, ate a quick meal, and tried to warm up with my little stove. The cold crept in through the thin walls, and I had trouble falling asleep. That night, the wind was fierce. It slammed against the tent, shaking the poles and making eerie sounds. Rain hammered the fabric nonstop. I lay awake for hours, listening to the storm rage outside. I kept telling myself that the weather would clear by morning, but I wasn't sure. When dawn came, the rain finally stopped, but the sky was still gray and low with clouds. I packed up quickly and started hiking again, hoping to reach a ranger station marked on the map about 10 miles away. The trail followed the river for a while, then climbed steeply up another ridge. The mud made every step slippery and exhausting. Around midday, I noticed the trail was less defined. It looked like a few people had passed recently, but the markers were faded or missing. I checked my GPS, but it was acting strangely, showing erratic readings. I switched it off and relied on the map and compass. The forest here was dense and dark, with thick undergrowth and fallen branches blocking the path. After hours of pushing through bushes and trying to find the trail, I realized I was lost. I had no clear landmarks, and the sky was still gray, dimming the light. My water supply was running low, and my food was only enough for another day or so. Panic crept in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I set up a temporary camp near a cluster of large trees and tried to rest. The next day, I tried retracing my steps, looking for any sign of the trail. The ground was soft and wet from the rain, and I found only faint footprints and broken branches. I was cold and hungry. My phone had no signal. I realized that nobody knew exactly where I was, and I hadn't told anyone my exact route. My heart sank. I kept moving cautiously, marking my path by stacking small piles of stones so I wouldn't circle back on myself. I followed the slope downhill, hoping to reach the river again or some open area. But the forest seemed endless and unchanging, thick trunks, moss-covered rocks, and tangled roots. On the third day lost, hunger was sharp, and my energy was low. I rationed what food I had, some trail mix, an energy bar, a small piece of jerky. I drank from streams but worried about waterborne germs. My clothes were damp, my skin sore from scratches and insect bites. I felt weak but knew I couldn't stop. That afternoon, I thought I heard voices in the distance, faint and muffled. I shouted and waved my arms, but the sound didn't get closer. I wondered if it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks. The forest felt oppressive, and I struggled to keep my spirits up. On the fourth day, I climbed a ridge to get a better view. From the top, I could see a patch of open ground in the distance, a clearing that might have roads or cabins. The sight gave me hope, but the climb was steep and tiring. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my hands and knees. Near the ridge top, I slipped on a wet stone and fell hard. My ankle twisted sharply, and I felt a sharp pain that made me gasp. I tried to stand, but my foot buckled. I was trapped. Panic surged again. I had no choice but to sit and rest. I wrapped my ankle with a strip torn from my shirt, trying to support it. The pain was dull but constant. I knew I had to move slowly or risk making the injury worse. I limped down the ridge as best I could, resting often. My pack was heavy, but I couldn't leave any gear behind. The cold was creeping in again as evening approached. That night, I huddled under a makeshift shelter I built from branches and leaves, using my emergency blanket for warmth. I was scared and exhausted. I thought about how easy it would be to give up, but I remembered why I came here, to push myself to survive. I resolved to keep going no matter what. On the fifth day, I moved carefully, taking tiny steps on my injured ankle. The clearing was closer now, but the forest was thick with fallen trees and thorny bushes. I kept moving toward the light, following the sun's direction. Finally, late that afternoon, I heard the distant sound of engines. I followed the noise, shouting and waving my arms. After what felt like forever, I saw a dirt road and a small ranger cabin, collapsed on the ground, overwhelmed. The ranger was surprised to see me, wet, dirty, and limping badly. They gave me water, food, and a first aid kit. Later, a search party found my campsite and trail markers. They told me the storm had caused mudslides and washed out parts of the trail, which explained why I got lost. They arranged a ride back to the nearest town, where I went to the hospital. My ankle was badly sprained but would heal with time. The experience had shaken me, but I was alive. Looking back, I realized how easy it was to underestimate nature. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. No ghost stories or monsters, just real dangers. Weather, terrain, and the loneliness of being far from help. I had survived by staying calm, making careful decisions, and never giving up. That was the true test. I had been planning this hike for months. The map showed a remote trail winding through a dense forest, leading up to a ridge with a spectacular view. The plan was simple: spend 2 days hiking alone, camp under the stars, and come back feeling refreshed. I was not a professional or even an experienced hiker. This was just something I wanted to do by myself, to clear my mind and break from the noise of the city. I started early that morning, just after sunrise. The sky was clear, the air cool but fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I packed light: a backpack with a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, a map, compass, and a small first aid kit. My phone was fully charged, but I knew there wouldn't be service deep in the woods. The trail was narrow and overgrown in some parts, but I could see footprints here and there. It wasn't heavily traveled, but it was clear enough. Birds were chirping, squirrels darted through the branches, and every so often I caught the sound of a distant woodpecker. The quiet and peace felt good. The forest was alive in a way the city never is. By noon, I reached a small clearing beside a creek. I sat down on a rock to eat some trail mix and refill my water bottle. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the ground. It was perfect. After a quick rest, I kept going. The trail started to climb steadily. The forest grew thicker, the trees taller and older. The moss on the trunks was thick and damp. The ground was soft underfoot. At times, I had to step over fallen branches or duck under low-hanging limbs. I felt my heart rate pick up, but the exertion was good, satisfying. Hours passed, and I noticed the trail markers were getting less frequent. The path was harder to follow. I stopped to check the map and compass. Everything looked right, but I had a nagging feeling that I might have taken a wrong turn. I reminded myself to stay calm. I could retrace my steps if I needed to. Eventually, the trail vanished altogether. The trees were so dense here, the ground so covered in leaves and twigs, that I couldn't tell where the path was anymore. I walked slowly, trying to find any sign of the trail. Then I heard it, the faint sound of rushing water. It wasn't on the map, but I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead me back or to a river I could use as a reference point. The creek was narrow but fast, flowing through a small ravine. I carefully made my way along the bank, the ground slippery and uneven. At one point, I slipped on a wet rock and caught myself just in time, heart pounding. I stayed close to the creek, hoping it would guide me out. The sun started to dip low. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I realized I had no idea where I was. My phone showed no signal. My water supply was running low, and my food was almost gone. I felt a cold pit of worry open in my stomach. I decided to find a place to camp for the night. The ground near the creek was soggy and uneven, but a little farther up, I spotted a patch of dry earth surrounded by fir trees. I set up my tent quickly, hands shaking. I kept my backpack close and prepared for a cold night. As darkness fell, the forest sounds changed. The birds stopped singing, replaced by the rustle of leaves and distant calls of animals. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I told myself it was just deer or small animals. Still, the feeling of being alone in the wilderness pressed in hard. I wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, trying to calm down. I thought about the mistakes I'd made, not paying enough attention to the trail, overestimating my ability to navigate. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Around midnight, a noise outside the tent startled me. Something big moving through the brush. I froze, listening. It was too heavy to be a deer. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A wild boar? The forest had its dangers, but I had never encountered anything close before. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping it would move on. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded. I waited a long time before trying to sleep, but exhaustion finally claimed me. Morning came gray and cold. I packed up quickly, desperate to find my way out. I followed the creek upstream, hoping to reach a road or campsite. The terrain grew rougher, steep slopes, tangled undergrowth, fallen trees. My legs ached, muscles tight from the cold and stress. Midday brought sun, but I was dehydrated and weak. My water bottle was empty. I spotted some berries on a bush but didn't recognize them, so I left them alone. Better safe than poisoned. I heard a faint sound of voices in the distance. Hope surged in me. I shouted, but the sound seemed swallowed by the trees. I ran toward it, stumbling down a steep hill, barely stopping myself from falling. After hours of walking, I came to a dirt road. It was old and rarely used, overgrown at the edges. I followed it, finally seeing tire tracks in the mud. My heart lifted. This had to lead to civilization. I kept going until I saw a parked car up ahead. A man was standing by it holding a walkie-talkie. I waved my arms frantically, calling for help. He looked startled but hurried over. Without words, I showed him my phone with no signal. He radioed for help. Minutes later, a Ranger Jeep appeared. They checked me over, gave me water, and loaded me into the vehicle. Back at the ranger station, I learned that the area had no real marked trails where I had been wandering. The creek I followed was not on the map, and the forest there was known for its confusing landscape. Several hikers had gotten lost recently. I felt lucky, exhausted, and grateful. The experience had been terrifying. I had underestimated the wild and paid the price with fear and exhaustion. But I survived. That night, safe in a motel bed, I thought about what had happened. The forest was beautiful but unforgiving. The lesson was clear: respect nature, prepare fully, and never take wilderness for granted. The morning air was crisp and fresh as I tightened the straps on my backpack and looked up the narrow trail ahead. It was early spring, the kind of day where the sun was just starting to warm the earth, but there was still a faint chill that made me glad I'd worn my thicker jacket. The mountain I planned to hike was known for its rugged terrain and quiet beauty, and I was eager to spend the day alone with nothing but my thoughts and the sounds of the forest. I had been hiking a lot over the past few years. It was something I did not just for exercise, but to get away from the noise of everyday life. The steady rhythm of walking, the smell of pine needles, the distant call of birds. It all helped me clear my head. This particular trail was less popular, which was part of the appeal. Fewer people meant a better chance of being truly alone. The trailhead was marked by a simple wooden sign, faded but still legible. As I stepped onto the path, the forest seemed to close in around me. Tall trees on either side, their branches stretching high into the sky. The ground beneath my boots was soft with pine needles, and I could hear the faint crunch of small twigs as I walked. The only sounds were my breathing and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. At first, the trail was easy. It wound gently uphill, passing patches of wildflowers and moss-covered rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle or to wipe sweat from my brow. Even though the air was cool, the steady climb warmed me quickly. About an hour in, the trail began to steepen sharply. I had expected this, and I shifted my pack to a more comfortable position and slowed my pace. The forest here was thicker, the trees older and closer together. Sunlight barely reached the ground. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was strong. I kept my eyes on the path, careful not to lose my footing on the loose gravel. Despite my care, I stumbled over a hidden root and caught myself against a tree. My heart rate jumped for a moment, but I smiled to myself. It was the kind of small scare that reminded me how real the wilderness was, how it demanded attention and respect. I pushed onward. My legs were getting tired, but I welcomed the challenge. Hiking had taught me patience, endurance, and focus. It was almost a meditation. After another half hour, the trees thinned out, and I emerged onto a ridge. From here, I could see the valley below, a patchwork of fields and forests stretching to the horizon. The sky was a deep blue, cloudless and bright. I paused and pulled out my camera, wanting to capture the view. I took several photos, careful to frame the layers of hills and distant mountains. As I packed the camera away, I noticed the wind picking up. It was a sharp, cold breeze that rattled the branches above. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and scanned the sky. No clouds, but the air felt different, heavier somehow. I decided to push on. The trail ahead was supposed to lead to a small lake near the summit, a place I'd read about in a hiking guide. The guide mentioned that the lake was a quiet spot, surrounded by rocky outcrops and a few hardy pine trees, perfect for a rest. The path from the ridge was narrow and rocky. It twisted and turned sharply, following the natural contours of the mountain. I had to watch my footing carefully. Every now and then, the trail passed close to steep drop-offs that disappeared into dense forest below. As I continued, I started to notice signs that the area was less traveled than I had expected. There were broken branches on the path, but no footprints. The ground was soft in places, suggesting recent rain, but no clear tracks. This gave me a mild sense of unease, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the quiet, the kind of silence that felt thick and watching. About an hour later, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I had imagined, a clear pool of cold water surrounded by smooth granite boulders. The surface was still, reflecting the sky and the trees perfectly. I sat on a rock near the edge and took a long drink from my water bottle. The peace of the place was deep. I closed my eyes and took a slow, steady breath, trying to drink in the silence. After a few minutes, I opened my eyes and scanned the shoreline. Something caught my attention, a small set of footprints leading away from the lake, heading back into the forest. They were fresh, maybe only a few hours old. I frowned. I hadn't seen any other hikers all day, and the trail back was quiet. Curious, I stood and followed the footprints. They led down a narrow path that twisted between trees and rocks. I walked carefully, not wanting to disturb anything. The footprints stopped abruptly about 100 meters into the forest. I looked around, puzzled. There was no sign of anyone or anything else. The silence felt even heavier here, like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to head back to the lake. As I retraced my steps, I began to feel an odd prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you think someone might be watching you. I slowed my pace and listened carefully. The forest was still. No birds, no animals, no wind in the trees. Just silence. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was probably just the quiet playing tricks on me, but I kept looking over my shoulder. Back at the lake, I sat down again and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I told myself I was overreacting. There was nothing here but trees and rocks. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. A figure, a man, was standing among the trees about 50 meters away. He was motionless, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. The man didn't move. I couldn't tell much about him. He was dressed in dark clothes that blended into the forest. I slowly reached into my pack and pulled out my phone, ready to call for help. But then I remembered there was no signal here, none at all. Panic began to rise. I told myself to stay calm. The man might just be another hiker, maybe lost or waiting. I stood up slowly, facing him without making sudden moves. Then, without warning, he stepped forward, breaking the line of trees. I could see his face now, sharp features, cold eyes. There was something hard in his gaze that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything. He just walked toward me. I stepped back, heart pounding. I looked around for a place to run. The trail was narrow, but I spotted a small slope that led up to a cluster of rocks. I turned and ran as fast as I could, scrambling up the slope and over the rocks. Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps. I kept running, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. My legs burned, my lungs gasped for air, but I didn't stop. I reached the ridge again and kept running toward the trailhead. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and saw the parking lot where I had left my car. The man was nowhere in sight. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my car, doors locked and engine running. I sat there, hands shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I could say. A man watching me in the woods? No proof, no evidence. I started the engine and drove away, the mountain disappearing in the rearview mirror. In the days that followed, I tried to shake the memory. I went back to the mountain once more during daylight and with friends. The trail was peaceful, the forest quiet as ever. But the feeling lingered, that the wilderness was not just beautiful, but sometimes dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with wild animals or weather. I reported the incident to the park rangers. They told me they had heard rumors of a man who sometimes stalked hikers on that trail, though there was little concrete information. They advised me to hike in groups and always tell someone my plans. I changed my habits after that hike. I started hiking only with others, carrying a GPS tracker and a whistle. I learned how important it was to be prepared not just for nature's challenges but for other people, the unknown ones. The mountain was still beautiful. The air still smelled like pine and earth. But I understood now that the woods were not always safe. Sometimes the scariest thing out there was just another person. And that is the truth I carry with me every time I lace up my boots and step onto a trail. I decided to hike the ridge trail early in the morning. It was late September, and the cool air had a sharpness to it that made me breathe deeper. The sun was just waking up, its light spreading soft and pale through the thin fog that still clung low to the ground. The forest was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves scattered along the dirt path. I had packed light, just a backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, my phone, and a map. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from my home, so I got there just as the sky was brightening. The ridge trail was supposed to be a moderate hike, roughly 10 miles round trip, following a narrow ridge that offered some of the best views in the region. I had never done it before, but I'd read that it was popular enough to be well-marked, yet wild enough to feel remote. I was excited for a solo hike, just me and the forest. The first few miles passed easily. The trail wound through thick stands of pine and fir, their needles releasing a faint resinous scent. I could hear birds, mostly sparrows and jays, but no one else was around. I saw no other hikers. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves, broken branches, and the occasional patch of moss. The ground underfoot was firm, but I had to watch for roots and stones that might trip me. As I walked, I thought about how rare it was for me to get away like this. Work had been stressful, and the city felt loud and cramped. Here, in the woods, the quiet was something I hadn't realized I craved so badly. After about 2 hours, I reached the first major viewpoint. The ridge opened up, and I could see miles of rolling hills and dense forests spreading out below me. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows between the trees and turning the leaves a rich gold and red. I sat on a rock to rest, taking a long drink of water and nibbling on a granola bar. The air was cool but not cold, the kind that fills your lungs with freshness. I checked the time and decided to keep going. The trail ahead was said to be a bit rougher, with some steep sections and loose gravel. I tightened the straps on my pack and started upward again. After a while, the forest began to change. The tall pines thinned out, and the trees were shorter, more scrubby. The ground was rockier, and I noticed the trail narrowing, barely wide enough for 1 foot to step without risking a slip. The wind picked up here, carrying with it a sharp chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around my waist. I reached a narrow pass where the trail clung to the side of a steep slope. The drop on my left was sudden and deep, a sheer fall of maybe 100 feet or more. I slowed down, careful with each step. The gravel underfoot was loose, and I could feel it sliding slightly with each movement. I reminded myself to keep calm and watch where I put my feet. I paused to catch my breath, looking out across the valley below. The early morning fog had burned off completely, replaced by clear blue sky. The sunlight reflected off the leaves in a way that made everything look almost too bright, too perfect. But then I noticed something strange. Far across the valley, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw a small group of figures moving slowly through the forest. At first, I thought it was another group of hikers, but as I looked closer, the figures didn't look right. They were too spread out, and their movements were slow, almost cautious. They seemed to be dressed in dark clothes, but I couldn't be sure. I felt a sudden chill. I told myself it was just other hikers or hunters starting their day. The Ridge Trail was popular with hunters during the fall, and maybe this was just them. Still, the feeling of being watched settled in. I brushed it off and started hiking again, focusing on the trail. About an hour later, the trail descended sharply into a small valley, a break in the ridge where a creek ran through. The air smelled damp and fresh here. The forest was thicker, the trees tall and close together. The ground was covered in ferns and fallen branches. I stopped again to refill my water bottle at the creek, careful not to disturb the clear water. As I bent down, I heard a twig snap somewhere behind me. I froze. The forest was quiet again except for the soft rush of the creek. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that hiking alone meant hearing every small sound more clearly than usual. Probably a squirrel or a bird. I kept going, but I was more alert now. The trail here was muddy in places, and I had to step carefully. The trees felt tighter around me, the light dimmer under the thick canopy. The forest seemed darker than before. After another hour, I came to a clearing with a ruined stone cabin in the center. The cabin was small and weathered, the roof mostly collapsed. The walls were covered in moss and vines. I'd read that there were some old logging cabins scattered along the trail, relics from 100 years ago when the forest was harvested more heavily. I walked around the cabin slowly, curious. Inside, the floor was dirt and littered with broken wood and leaves. It smelled musty and old. I took a photo with my phone and moved on. That's when I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They were human boots, I guessed fairly large. The prints led away from the cabin and back into the forest, heading deeper into the trees, off the trail. I stopped and looked at the trail ahead. It split here, one path continuing along the ridge, narrow and rocky, the other heading down toward the creek valley again. The footprints were moving away from the ridge. I felt a moment of unease. Why would someone be wandering off the trail here? I looked around but saw no one. The forest was still too still. I debated turning back. The day was getting on, and the sky was starting to cloud over slightly. I was halfway through the hike and felt tired, but I told myself to stay calm. I had done solo hikes before. There was no reason to panic. I decided to keep to the main trail along the ridge. The narrow path soon became steeper and more difficult. Loose stones made footing tricky, and the air was cooler and damper. I had to use my hands to steady myself in some places, gripping rocks and tree roots. As I climbed higher, the wind picked up again, carrying a cold bite that seeped through my jacket. The trees were more sparse, twisted by the wind and weather. The path was barely visible in some places, covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I reached a rocky outcrop that gave another great view of the valley below. The sun was now behind clouds, and the light was gray and muted. I pulled my jacket tighter and rested on a flat rock, drinking more water. While sitting there, I heard something that made my heart jump. A distant shout, faint but sharp. It didn't sound like an animal. It was a human voice yelling or maybe calling for help. I stood up quickly and scanned the valley below. There was no one visible. The forest was still. The wind carried the sound again, a faint echo. I debated what to do. The sound came from the valley near the creek. I knew the trail would take me back down toward the valley if I continued, but the ridge trail was supposed to loop back eventually. Still, the voice was weak and distant, maybe a lost hiker or hunter. I thought about calling emergency services, but my phone had only a little battery left, and there was no signal here anyway. I decided to continue along the ridge and keep my eyes and ears open. The trail became steeper and rockier. At one point, I had to scramble over a large boulder to continue. My hands were dirty and scratched from gripping the rough stone. I realized I was further along than I thought. The trail was getting harder to follow in places, covered in debris and branches from recent storms. I felt tired, and my legs ached from the constant climbing. Suddenly, the weather changed. A cold wind whipped through the trees, stronger now, making the branches sway and creak. Dark clouds moved in overhead, blocking out most of the light. I started walking faster, wanting to find shelter or get back down before the rain came. The trail narrowed even more and skirted a cliff edge on my right. One wrong step here could mean a long fall. The wind was so strong now that it almost pushed me sideways. I clung to tree trunks and rocks, fighting to keep my balance. The sky darkened more, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I pulled my rain jacket out of my pack and put it on quickly. The rain came down harder, cold and sharp. The trail became slippery and dangerous. I had to stop several times to catch my breath and steady myself. I realized that I had been so focused on the trail that I hadn't noticed how isolated I was. No other hikers, no sound but the wind and rain. As I moved along, I thought about the footprints near the cabin. Were they still around? Was someone following me? The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Suddenly, I heard a crunching noise behind me, something breaking branches. I froze, heart pounding. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing except the swirling rain and mist. I started walking faster, trying not to run but moving as quickly as the slippery trail allowed. The noise came again, closer now, footsteps breaking twigs and leaves. Panic rose inside me. I looked for a place to hide, but there was nowhere, just the narrow trail. I have always loved hiking. The quiet of the woods, the smell of pine and wet earth, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. It all gave me a sense of peace I found nowhere else. I spent years exploring trails near my home, but I always had a dream to do a long solo hike in a more remote area, somewhere wild and challenging, where I could really test myself. That dream led me to plan a trip deep into the national forest in the mountains, far from the usual tourist paths. I prepared for months, gathering maps, reading trail guides, checking weather reports, and packing carefully. I wanted to be ready for anything. I chose a route that would take me through dense forests, over steep ridges, and across rivers. The total distance was around 40 miles, planned for 4 days of hiking with camping each night. On the first morning, I woke early. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the smell of dew and pine needles. My pack felt heavy on my back but comfortable. I started down the trail with a steady pace, my boots sinking softly into the dirt. The forest was alive with sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the gentle wind moving through the trees. The path was clear and well-marked, and I felt good as I moved deeper into the wilderness. The first day passed without incident. I crossed small streams using fallen logs and made my way through thick groves of fir and spruce. Every so often, I stopped to rest and drink water, taking time to soak in the beauty around me. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the branches and creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. I saw squirrels darting between trees, and once a hawk soared overhead, its sharp cry echoing through the air. I found a small clearing for my first campsite, cleared a spot for my tent, and set up quickly. I cooked a simple meal on my stove, ate slowly while watching the sky change colors as evening approached, then crawled into my sleeping bag as night fell. The stars were bright, and the forest felt calm. The second day was tougher. The trail climbed steeply up a ridge, and my legs ached with the effort. The air grew thinner and colder as I gained elevation. The trees thinned out, replaced by scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. The path was narrow and slippery in places, with loose gravel underfoot that made footing uncertain. I moved carefully, stopping often to catch my breath. The views grew better as I climbed, with distant mountain peaks rising sharp against the sky. I felt proud to be making it this far. But as the afternoon wore on, I started to notice something strange. The trail, which had been well marked, became less obvious. The usual painted blazes on trees were missing or faded. The path twisted and forked in places, and I found myself pausing longer, trying to figure out the right direction. I double-checked my map and compass often, but the forest all looked the same. I kept telling myself to stay calm and focused, but a small knot of worry started to grow inside me. Eventually, I reached a rocky outcrop and stopped to rest. I took out my water bottle and sipped slowly, looking around. The wind was stronger here, and the trees were sparse. I tried to spot the next marker, but there was nothing clear. I felt a chill beyond the cold wind, a feeling of uncertainty. I decided to push on, trusting my compass and the map, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. As evening approached, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. I needed to find a safe place to camp, but the terrain was rough and exposed. I finally found a small patch of flat earth near a cluster of hardy bushes. It was not ideal, but it was all I could find. I set up my tent quickly, knowing I needed shelter before dark. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the wind howling through the rocks. The forest was silent except for the occasional scrape of a branch or the distant call of a night bird. I tried to sleep but kept waking up, my mind racing with worries. Had I taken a wrong turn? Was I off the trail? What if I got lost out here, alone? The third day started with a thick fog hanging low over the ridge. I packed my gear in the damp cold and tried to steady my nerves. The trail was even harder to follow in the mist. I slowed my pace, moving carefully between rocks and twisted shrubs. My boots slipped on wet stones, and my muscles ached from the steep climb. I relied heavily on my compass and map, frequently checking to avoid wandering off course. At one point, I realized I had not seen any other hikers or signs of human presence for hours. No footprints, no litter, no broken branches. It was as if I had entered a part of the forest where few people ever came. The silence was thick, and the fog made everything seem gray and unreal. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a fallen tree blocking the path. It was large and heavy, with thick roots torn from the earth. I climbed over it, scraping my hands on the rough bark. As I moved past, I noticed fresh marks in the soil, deep, wide footprints much larger than mine. They were too big for a bear, too deep and irregular for any small animal. The prints headed into the fog, away from the trail. My heart quickened. I told myself it was probably a large animal, maybe a mountain lion or a bear. I had read about their tracks, and it matched none exactly. Still, the idea that something big had been so close unsettled me. I decided to keep moving and find a better place to camp before the fog got worse. I came across a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a little creek nearby. It seemed safe, with fresh water and enough flat ground for my tent. I set up quickly, ate a little food, and tried to rest. That night was the worst. I lay awake listening to strange noises, cracks of branches breaking, low growls carried on the wind, the sound of something heavy moving nearby. I stayed inside my tent, heart pounding, clutching my flashlight and knife. I was alone, deep in the wilderness, with no help anywhere close. Sleep finally came in short bursts, and I woke early, exhausted but determined to finish the hike. I packed up as dawn broke, the fog still hanging thick but thinning slowly. I checked my map and compass carefully and started down what I hoped was the correct path. As I descended, the trees thickened again, and the air grew warmer. The trail became clearer with fresh blazes on the trees. Relief washed over me. I kept a steady pace, drinking water and eating small snacks from my pack. But then, as I rounded a bend in the trail near a small stream, I saw something that stopped me cold. There were more footprints, fresh and deep, crossing the trail and heading upstream. These were the same huge prints I had seen the day before. They were spaced far apart, showing long strides. I looked around, trying to spot any sign of the creature that had made them. I saw nothing at first, only the quiet forest. Then movement, a flash of dark fur between the trees, disappearing quickly behind a thick pine. My heart hammered. I froze, listening for any sound, but all was still. I knew I had to move fast now. I didn't want to run because I knew that might provoke a chase, but I walked quickly and deliberately back toward the main trail. The prints followed the same direction, always nearby. The sun was high now, and I could see a valley ahead, where the forest thinned out and a dirt road should be. If I could reach that road, I would be safe. I pushed my legs harder, ignoring the aches and the burn in my lungs. After what felt like hours, the trees finally opened, and I saw the road below. I scrambled down the last steep slope, stumbling over rocks and roots, until I reached the dirt road. My phone had no signal, but the road meant people were close. I followed the road slowly, careful not to lose my footing, until I heard the sound of a car engine. I walked toward the sound, waving my arms to attract attention. A truck slowed and stopped nearby, and the driver looked surprised to see me, disheveled and dirty. Without needing to say anything, I climbed into the truck, grateful beyond words. I told them the story as best I could, and they listened quietly, concerned. They offered to drive me back to town and to the ranger station. At the ranger station, I reported the footprints and the sighting. Rangers told me that in recent weeks, there had been reports of a large mountain lion or possibly a cougar in the area. They had been tracking it, but it was elusive and dangerous. I realized how lucky I had been. I had prepared well and stayed calm, but I had come face to face with something truly wild and dangerous. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is not forgiving, and respect is necessary. After resting and recovering, I vowed to hike again, but I also knew I would never take the wild for granted. That trip taught me the limits of my own strength and the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for nature's power. I had always loved the outdoors. The smell of pine trees, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the chill of early morning air brushing against my skin. It all felt like freedom. I planned this solo hiking trip for months. The trail was supposed to be tough but manageable, a known route in a remote mountain range with dense forest, rocky ridges, and some creeks to cross. I packed my gear carefully: a sturdy backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, water purification tablets, enough food for 4 days, a map, a compass, and a basic first aid kit. I had told no one my exact plans, only that I was going hiking to clear my head. I wanted the silence, the solitude. The morning I started, the sky was pale and overcast. There was no sun, just a quiet gray light filtering through the clouds. The forest greeted me with the usual calm. Birds were faintly chirping, and the wind whispered through the branches. The trail was narrow and uneven but well marked with orange paint on trees every few hundred meters. I followed it steadily, careful to keep my pace steady to avoid tiring out too soon. By midday, I had reached a clearing on a ridge with a view of the valley below. The clouds hung low, shrouding the distant peaks in mist. I stopped to eat a quick lunch, trail mix and an energy bar, washing it down with water from my bottle. The air smelled fresh and cool. I rested for about 20 minutes, then packed up and continued. The forest grew thicker as I went deeper. The trees were tall, their trunks covered with moss and lichen. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, damp from last night's rain. I crossed a small creek on some slippery rocks, careful not to lose balance. The path became steeper, with roots and rocks making it harder to walk. I was feeling tired but determined. Around late afternoon, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed 2 routes. The left path was shorter but steeper. The right was longer but easier. I chose the left, thinking I could save time and maybe find a good spot to camp by nightfall. The path immediately became more difficult. Rocks jutting out, muddy patches, and thick underbrush pressing in from both sides. Then the first problem happened. I tripped on a root hidden under a pile of leaves. I fell hard onto my right side, scraping my arm and twisting my ankle. Pain flared sharply, but I forced myself to stand. My ankle was swollen and tender, but I could still put weight on it if I was careful. I rested for several minutes, breathing heavily and trying to calm my pounding heart. I knew I had to keep moving before dark. Slowly, I continued, Each step was careful and cautious, placing my foot down gently, trying not to twist the ankle further. The forest was growing darker under the thick canopy. I realized that the sun would set soon, and I was nowhere near a campsite. Panic started to creep in. After what felt like hours, I noticed the trail fading. The orange markers were scarce and sometimes missing. I stopped and looked around. The trees all looked the same, and the terrain was confusing. I pulled out my map and compass. The compass needle wavered a little, probably because of the rocky soil and metal in my backpack, but I adjusted for it. Using landmarks I had memorized, I tried to find the trail again. I found a faint path heading downhill, but it looked like an animal track or a less used game trail rather than the main path. My gut told me it might lead somewhere. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows stretched long and dark between the trees. I debated staying put, but the cold and the dark made me uneasy. I chose to follow the faint trail, hoping it would reconnect with the main path or lead to water. The forest around me felt different, quieter, denser. The air was colder and damper. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. My ankle throbbed painfully with each step, but I forced myself forward. Night fell fully, and I had no flashlight. My phone was dead, the battery drained from lack of signal and cold. I could barely see the trail. I tried to move slowly, feeling my way along the path. The darkness around me was complete, and the forest felt like it closed in from all sides. My breathing was shallow and fast. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way I never had before. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a low growl coming from nearby. My heart stopped. I froze, listening. The sound came again, a little louder this time. It was an animal, definitely a predator, maybe a mountain lion or a wolf. I had read about them in this area, but had never feared encountering one until now. I remembered advice from survival guides. Don't run, don't turn your back, make yourself look big, and try to scare it away. I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and raised it over my head, yelling and banging it on a tree trunk. The growling stopped, replaced by rustling in the bushes. I waited, trembling, but the animal did not come closer. After a few minutes, the sounds faded. I exhaled slowly, feeling relief mixed with fear. But then I realized something worse. I was completely lost. The faint trail I followed had vanished under a thick tangle of bushes. I was in the middle of dense forest with no light, a swollen ankle, and no way to call for help. The cold was biting into my bones, and the dampness made me shiver. I tried to think clearly. I took out my emergency whistle and blew it 3 times. No answer. I blew again and again, but no sound came back. The silence was absolute except for the distant call of an owl. I decided I had to make a shelter. I couldn't keep walking in the dark and risk injury or worse. Using the few branches and leaves nearby, I built a crude lean-to against a fallen tree. I gathered dry leaves and pine needles to make a bed. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and tried to calm my shaking body. I had a small fire starter kit, but no dry wood good enough to ignite easily in the damp forest. After many attempts, I managed to light a small flame. The warmth was barely enough to stop my fingers from numbness. I stayed awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind whistled softly, branches creaked, and every now and then I heard a distant animal cry. I forced myself to stay alert. If I slept too deeply, I might not wake up to escape if something came close. Morning came slowly, the sky still gray and overcast. I was cold, sore, and exhausted. My ankle hurt worse after the restless night. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to find the trail or a way out. I waited for the dim light to improve, then packed up my shelter as best as I could. I studied the compass again and tried to orient myself towards the east, where the trailhead should be. I moved slowly, each step a struggle. The swollen ankle made it almost impossible to walk normally, but I kept going. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless and unchanging. I was dehydrated, hungry, and scared. I drank water from a small stream I found, filtering it with my purification tablets. The cold water helped wake me up. Eventually, I stumbled upon a faint path again. This time, it looked like the real trail. I followed the orange markers carefully. I felt hope grow inside me, but I stayed cautious. I was too weak and injured to take any risks. Late afternoon, I finally saw a distant plume of smoke. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it came from a small campsite with a few hikers sitting around a fire. They hadn't seen me yet. I called out weakly. They noticed me and came over quickly. One helped me sit down. Another gave me water and a bandage for my ankle. They radioed for help on their satellite phone. Relief flooded my body. A rescue team arrived a few hours later, bringing me to safety. At the hospital, they confirmed I had a bad sprain and some minor cuts, but nothing broken. I felt lucky to be alive. The experience taught me how fragile life could be in the wilderness, how quickly things could go wrong, even on a familiar trail. I realized the importance of preparation, respect for nature, and never hiking alone without letting someone know your plans. The fear and helplessness I felt that night still haunt me sometimes, but I also know that day made me stronger. I survived because I stayed calm, used what I had, and never gave up. I always thought hiking was a simple thing. You pack your bag, lace your boots, pick a trail and walk. Simple. I never imagined how much things could go wrong. But that day on the ridge, I learned just how fragile you are in the wilderness, how easily a small mistake or a bad break can turn a normal hike into a fight to stay safe. It started like any other hiking day. I had planned to do a long solo trek along a well-known ridge trail in the mountains. It was late spring. The snow had mostly melted, but the water in the streams was still high from the runoff. The weather was clear when I left the trailhead just after dawn, with the sun still low and cool air brushing my face. I had done this hike before a few years back, so I thought I knew the route well. The trail began easy enough. It wound through tall pines, their needles soft underfoot. Birds chirped in the branches above. The smell of pine and wet earth was strong. The first few miles were gentle, the path wide and clear. I had my pack with a few essentials: water, snacks, a map, compass, some extra clothes, and a small first aid kit. My phone had no signal here, but I wasn't worried. I was experienced enough to navigate without it. About 2 hours in, I reached the point where the trail narrowed and began to climb steeply. The ridge itself was a thin line of earth, dropping sharply on both sides. I stopped to catch my breath and admire the view. Below, the valley spread out like a painting. Forests, rivers, and in the distance, the small town where I had parked. The sun was higher now, warming the air. I refilled my water bottle at a cold stream that crossed the trail and moved on. The trail up the ridge was rocky, and the path twisted along the edge with sheer drops beside me. It was thrilling but demanding. I took steady steps, careful not to slip. The rocks were still damp from recent rain, and some patches of mud made footing tricky. The wind had picked up, a sharp chill from the north, and I pulled my jacket tighter. Around midday, I reached a small flat clearing on the ridge, a perfect spot to rest. I ate some trail mix and drank water, scanning the horizon. Dark clouds were gathering in the west, a sign that the weather might turn. I debated whether to turn back or push forward. The forecast had said clear skies all day, but mountain weather is always unpredictable. I decided to keep going, telling myself I'd head down the other side before the storm came. The trail beyond the clearing looked narrower and less traveled. The trees were sparse here, the wind louder. The path led along the edge of a steep slope covered in loose scree and boulders. I stepped carefully, knowing one false move could send me tumbling. Then I noticed something strange. On the ground near the edge were fresh footprints. They were deep in the soft soil and looked recent. Someone else had been here, maybe earlier that morning. It made me uneasy, but I was alone and far from any other hikers. The trail wasn't busy. I thought it could be a hunter or another hiker. I quickened my pace, wanting to cover more ground before the storm. The clouds were darker now, thunder rumbling softly. I glanced back. The valley was already hidden by a gray curtain of rain. Up ahead, the path climbed again, winding between jagged rocks. I reached a small peak and paused. The wind was fierce, pushing hard against me. I tightened my jacket collar and looked around. That's when I realized I was off the main trail. The path ahead didn't match the map in my hand. The markers on the trees, small painted blazes, were missing here. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail I thought I was following had disappeared into thick bushes. I could hear the wind, the distant thunder, and my own breathing. No birds, no signs of animals. Panic started to creep in. I sat down on a rock and tried to think clearly. My compass was still working, so I oriented myself. I was roughly where I thought I should be, but the trail was gone. Somehow, I had taken a wrong turn at a fork hidden by branches. I had to find the main trail again before the storm hit. I packed up and moved slowly, scanning the ground for any signs, footprints, blazes, broken branches. The terrain was rough, uneven, and wet. The clouds darkened further, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The wind tore at my clothes and hair. Suddenly, my foot slipped on a slick rock, and I fell hard. A sharp pain shot through my ankle. I lay there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to breathe. The pain was bad, not broken, but definitely sprained. I couldn't put weight on my foot. I was stuck, and the storm was coming fast. I knew I had to act. Sitting there meant danger from the cold, rain, and exposure. I used my backpack as a cushion and wrapped my ankle tightly with my scarf. My hands trembled. I looked around, no shelter in sight, only rocky slopes and sparse trees. The rain fell harder now, a steady pounding that soaked my clothes through. I forced myself to stand, leaning on a sturdy branch for support. Every step was agony. The wind screamed, and the temperature dropped. I was alone, lost, injured, and the storm was closing in. I kept moving, slow and careful, toward the direction my compass pointed, back toward the trailhead, the safest place I could think of. The wind whipped rain into my face, making it hard to see. Thunder cracked close by, and I prayed I wouldn't be struck. Hours passed in a blur of wet rocks and pain. I fell again, cursed silently, and got up. At one point, I slipped and slid down a slope, narrowly avoiding a tumble down the cliff. I realized how close I had come to dying by accident. The night came without mercy. The storm raged, and I had no tent or proper shelter. I found a small overhang between rocks and huddled under it, shivering. My ankle throbbed with every heartbeat. My fingers were numb. I ate the last of my snacks and tried to sleep. The cold was brutal. The rain soaked me to the bone. I kept telling myself to stay awake, to keep moving when the storm eased. I thought about my family, my friends, the life waiting beyond these mountains. I thought about how fragile life is when you are cut off from everything familiar. Morning came, gray and misty. The storm had passed, but the world was drenched and silent. My ankle was swollen, and I could barely walk. I had no choice but to keep moving downhill, hoping to find help. The sun tried to break through the clouds, warming the wet earth. Birds returned cautiously, and the forest sounds came back. I followed the compass carefully, picking my way through fallen branches and muddy ground. Hours later, just when I was losing hope, I heard a faint voice calling. It was distant but real. I shouted back with all my strength, and soon a figure appeared on the trail, a park ranger doing a morning patrol. Relief flooded through me like a wave. They helped me onto their ATV and gave me water and dry clothes. At the ranger station, they treated my ankle, called for a helicopter evacuation, and reassured me that help was always close, but only if you didn't give up. The whole experience changed me. I learned to respect the wilderness and never underestimate the risks, even on familiar trails. I realized how important preparation, patience, and calm thinking are when things go wrong. Most of all, I understood that being alone in nature means depending on yourself, your skills, and your will to survive. No fairy tales, no luck, just reality. That day on the ridge was a hard lesson, but I survived it. And that survival was something I would never take for granted again. The sun had barely risen when I stepped onto the narrow dirt trail that snaked its way into the dense forest. I had planned this hike for weeks, preparing my backpack with water, snacks, a map, compass, first aid kit, and some extra clothes. The mountain I aimed to reach was not famous, not overly popular, but it was known locally for its challenging terrain and breathtaking views. The kind of place where a person could disappear without much notice. The air was cool and fresh, still holding onto the dampness left by the night's light rain. My boots crunched softly on the scattered leaves and twigs, and I could hear the distant call of birds waking up. The trail was lined with thick trees, mostly tall pines and hardwoods, some of them old, with rough bark that looked like it had been there for decades. The forest floor was a mix of ferns, moss, and small wildflowers. I took a deep breath, feeling the calm and quiet that only such untouched nature can bring. I checked my watch. 6:30 a.m., plenty of time to make the summit and get back before dark. I kept my pace steady, focusing on the path ahead. At first, the trail was gentle, sloping upward in a way that felt manageable, but I knew the real climb would begin soon. After about an hour, the terrain changed. The soil gave way to rocks and roots that jutted out like traps, demanding attention with every step. I had to watch my footing carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The forest thinned out in some places, allowing the sun to filter through the branches, casting golden light on the leaves. Occasionally, a squirrel darted across the trail or a chipmunk peeked out from behind a log, eyes bright and curious. The sounds of nature were a soothing soundtrack. The rustle of leaves in the light breeze, the chirping of birds, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Around mid-morning, I reached a small clearing with a shallow stream running through it. The water was clear and cold, bubbling gently over smooth stones. I crouched down, cupped my hands, and took a long drink. The cold water was refreshing, waking me up even more. I sat on a flat rock nearby to rest for a few minutes, taking out a granola bar and eating slowly, savoring the quiet and the clean air. After the break, I refilled my water bottle at the stream using my portable filter. This was important because the climb ahead would be tougher, and I wanted to stay hydrated. The trail from the clearing was steeper now, winding up through rocky terrain and patches of loose gravel. The trees were spaced further apart, giving me a better view of the valley below. The landscape was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in dark green forest, and a river snaking through the middle like a silver ribbon. As I climbed, the air grew thinner and cooler. My breathing became heavier, and sweat ran down my back despite the chill. The trail was less defined here, worn by fewer hikers, and sometimes I had to stop and consult my map to make sure I was still on track. The rocks underfoot were sharp, and the slope was uneven, requiring steady concentration. About halfway to the summit, I found a spot to sit and catch my breath. I leaned against a large boulder, feeling the rough, cold stone through my shirt. The view was stunning, trees stretching endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional clearings and the winding river far below. I pulled out my camera and took some pictures, trying to capture the vastness and the beauty, but no photo could truly show how alive the place felt. The climb resumed after a few minutes. I noticed that the trees were now mostly short, stunted, and covered with thick moss and lichens. The soil was thin, and rocks covered the ground like broken tiles. The wind had picked up, cold and sharp against my face. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving. At one point, I had to scramble over a rocky ridge. The rocks were jagged and slippery with moss. My hands found cracks and crevices as I carefully made my way up. One wrong step here could mean a bad fall. My heart pounded, but I stayed focused. I took my time and made it over safely. Near the top, the trail disappeared entirely, replaced by a rough path marked by small cairns, piles of stones stacked to guide hikers. The wind was stronger here, and the sky had turned partly cloudy, with thick clouds rolling in from the west. I felt a prickle of unease but shrugged it off. Weather could change fast in the mountains. I had seen that many times before. I reached the summit just as the clouds thickened, and the sun disappeared behind them. The peak was rocky and exposed, with little vegetation. From this vantage point, I could see far into the distance. The forested valleys, the river, distant mountain ridges fading into the mist. I stayed there a while, catching my breath and enjoying the silence. The clouds moved quickly now, and a chill crept in with the wind. I knew I needed to start heading back soon if I wanted to avoid being caught in the dark. I packed up and began the descent, retracing my steps carefully over the rocky ridge. The trail was slippery from the earlier rain and the moss growing on the stones. I kept my focus sharp, aware that a fall here could be dangerous. After the ridge, I re-entered the patchy forest, where the wind was less fierce. The path was faint but still marked by cairns. I moved steadily, though the clouds now hung low, blotting out much of the daylight. It was becoming harder to see. About an hour into the descent, I came across something strange. On the trail, a section of loose gravel had shifted recently, and there were faint footprints, boots with thick soles, leading off the path into the denser woods. The prints looked fresh, maybe a few hours old. I paused, heart pounding. There was no one else I had seen on the trail all day. The footprints went in the direction opposite to the trail I was following. I felt a mix of curiosity and unease. I thought about following them but quickly decided against it. The forest here was thick and easy to get lost in. I turned my attention back to the trail and kept moving. Still, a small knot of worry formed in my stomach. What if someone was injured or lost nearby? As I continued, the light grew dimmer. The clouds had thickened so much that the day felt like late evening, though it was only mid-afternoon. I checked my watch, 3:45 p.m. I should have been nearly halfway down by now, but the terrain was slow and difficult. I took a short break beside a large fallen tree, drinking water and eating a small snack. My legs ached from the climb and the descent, and my feet felt sore inside my boots. I rubbed my calves and stretched carefully, trying to keep my muscles loose. After a few minutes, I stood and resumed the trail. The forest seemed darker now, shadows lengthening. The wind had died down, replaced by an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that makes every little noise stand out. Suddenly, I heard a faint cracking sound, like a branch breaking somewhere nearby. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, soft, deliberate. It wasn't far. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the thick underbrush. The forest here was dense with saplings and bushes, making it hard to see far. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. I started walking again, quicker now, eager to put distance between me and whatever was out there. The cracking noises continued, sometimes close, sometimes further away, as if following or circling me. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. I'd heard that bears were active this time of year, and they could be dangerous if surprised. I kept my hands free, ready to grab my walking stick if needed. My eyes darted around, scanning for movement. The forest felt alive, but not with the calm I'd experienced earlier. This was different, charged, tense. Then up ahead, I saw a flash of movement, dark, quick, and low to the ground. I stopped immediately. The trail forked here, one path going sharply downhill and the other veering uphill. I debated which way to go. The footprints I had seen earlier were on the uphill path, but this movement was on the downhill side. I chose downhill, hoping it would be safer and faster. I moved carefully but quickly, my ears straining for any sound. The cracking noises seemed to follow me, but now more distant. After several minutes of tense walking, I came to a wider part of the trail. The trees were spaced further apart, and I could see the faint glow of the sky through the branches. Relief flooded me, but then I noticed something else. Discarded items on the ground beside the trail. An empty water bottle, a ripped piece of cloth, some food wrappers. They looked recent. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Someone else had been here and possibly still was. I quickened my pace, eyes scanning for any sign of people or animals. The forest around me was quiet again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The trail began to level out, and I could hear the faint sound of a stream nearby. I followed it, hoping to reach the clearing I had seen on the way up. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. An old campsite. I had planned this hike for weeks. I'm not the kind of person to just pick a trail randomly and go. I usually do some research, read reviews, check maps, look for advice online or from people who've been there before. But this time was different. I was bored of the usual crowded spots and wanted something off the beaten path. So I found an old hiking forum where people talked about a trail deep in the mountains, one that was barely marked and rarely visited. The name of the trail was lost to time, but the forum called it the Forgotten Path. The trail was supposedly in a national forest, but it wasn't listed on any official park maps or guides. It was just something a few hikers mentioned in passing. They said it was beautiful but rough, with thick forests, steep climbs, and a few old logging roads crossed along the way. There were warnings too, about the trail being easy to lose, and that rescue could be slow if something went wrong. That was part of what pulled me in. I wanted to push myself to see if I could handle a real challenge. I packed my gear carefully. My backpack was heavy, but manageable. I had a water filter, extra food, a first aid kit, a GPS device, maps, both digital and paper, a compass, and the basics like a flashlight, extra batteries, and my multi-tool. I wore sturdy hiking boots and dressed in layers. The weather was supposed to be clear and cool, perfect for hiking. I left early in the morning, alone. The trailhead was hard to find. I drove down a narrow gravel road, the kind that seemed to get worse the further you went. Trees crowded close on both sides, their branches almost brushing the roof of my car. When I finally reached a small parking spot with no signs or markings, I felt a flicker of excitement. I stepped out, stretched, and double-checked my pack. The path started as a narrow dirt track, lined with bushes and trees so dense they blocked the sunlight in places. The air smelled fresh but heavy with pine and earth. I could hear birds singing high above in the canopy, and the soft rustle of leaves as a light breeze passed through. At first, the hike was peaceful and easy. The path twisted uphill, crossing small streams on weathered wooden bridges. Every now and then, I spotted wildflowers or bright green moss on the rocks. I stopped a few times to take pictures and catch my breath. The silence around me was comforting, broken only by the sounds of nature. But after a couple of hours, things started to change. The trail became less distinct. The dirt track faded into patches of grass and fallen leaves. I checked my GPS and map often, making sure I stayed on course, but the forest seemed to swallow the trail whole. I had to push aside branches and step carefully over tangled roots. My boots sank a little in damp soil where the sun never quite reached. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and twisted. The canopy was so dense that only faint specks of sunlight pierced through. It felt cooler here, almost chilly despite the day warming up. The forest floor was littered with dry leaves, broken twigs, and scattered stones. I moved slower now, eyes scanning for any sign of the trail. After a while, I found myself walking along what looked like an old logging road. The ground was wider and flattened, but the surface was cracked and overgrown with weeds. Trees lined the edges, but the road was empty of any recent tire tracks or footprints. It felt strange, like the forest was reclaiming what was once cleared. I followed the logging road for maybe an hour. I liked the rhythm of walking on solid ground, but my gut told me this wasn't the main trail anymore. The GPS showed I should have turned off somewhere back, but the dense forest made it hard to see any side paths. Then I saw it, a narrow break in the trees, almost hidden by bushes. It looked like a faint trail leading uphill, marked by a small pile of stones. Someone had stacked them deliberately, a cairn. I knew hikers sometimes left these to mark tricky parts of a trail. Relief washed over me. I stepped off the logging road and started climbing the hill. The slope was steep and rocky. My boots slipped on loose gravel several times, and I used my hands to steady myself on tree roots and branches. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air felt, and the sounds of the forest below faded. I stopped a few times to catch my breath and drink water. At the top, the trail seemed to disappear again. The hill leveled off into a dense patch of fir trees, their needles thick on the branches. It was darker here, almost gloomy. I scanned the area but saw no clear path forward. The GPS was still working but showed a vague, meandering line. I paused and looked around. The silence was heavy now. No birds, No breeze, just an almost tangible stillness. It felt like I had entered a part of the forest untouched for decades. I kept moving forward, pushing through thick underbrush. The ground was uneven and wet, and every step felt like an effort. Suddenly, I heard something, a faint sound, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. Not my own steps, but something else. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. The noise stopped. I looked around carefully but saw nothing. No animals, no people, just trees and shadows. I shook off the feeling and kept going. The trail was hard to follow, but I trusted the GPS and my compass. I was determined not to get lost. Hours passed. The sun began to dip lower behind the hills. The forest grew colder and darker. I noticed my hands were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from exhaustion. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of other hikers. No footprints, no trash, no marks on the trees. I was completely alone. Then something changed. The trail seemed to end abruptly at a steep cliff overlooking a narrow valley. The view was breathtaking. A patchwork of green forest and rocky peaks bathed in golden sunset light. But the path was gone. No way forward, no way back except the long climb down the hill I had just made. I sat down on a rock, pulling out my water and food. I was tired, hungry, and a little scared. The reality hit me. I had no idea if I could find my way back through this maze of trees before nightfall. I checked my GPS again. The screen flickered and then went blank. Panic rose in my chest. I tapped it, turned it off and on, but nothing. I was deep in the forest with no signal, no clear trail, and failing technology. I packed up my things and tried to retrace my steps. The climb down was harder than I remembered. Darkness fell faster than I expected. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. The forest was different at night. Sounds multiplied. A chorus of insects, the rustle of small animals, distant howls I couldn't identify. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I moved cautiously but quickly, desperate to get back to the logging road. At one point, I thought I saw a shape moving in the trees. It vanished when I blinked. My mind played tricks on me, but the fear was real. Hours passed like this. I was cold, tired, hungry, and scared. I stopped a few times to rest, but the fear kept me moving. Eventually, I reached the logging road again. The path was faint in the dark, but I followed it downhill, hoping it would lead me back to my car. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the glow of headlights through the trees. I burst out of the forest and onto the gravel road. My car was just where I left it. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sat there shaking. I realized how close I had come to getting truly lost. I learned something important that night. Nature is beautiful, but it is also dangerous when you underestimate it. No matter how prepared you think you are, the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes. I didn't hike the forgotten path again, and I always stick to marked trails now. The morning air was cold but fresh as I stood at the trailhead, my boots digging into the packed dirt of the parking lot. The sun had just started to peek over the ridges to the east, casting a soft golden glow on the surrounding trees. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, a long solo trip through the Blue Ridge Mountains, following a stretch of the Appalachian Trail that was known for its rugged terrain and deep forests. I packed lightly, carrying only what I needed. A sturdy backpack with a few days' worth of food, water, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a map, compass, first aid kit, and my trusty multi-tool. My phone was nearly dead, and I knew there would be no signal once I went deeper into the woods. I had been hiking alone before, but this trail was different. It was remote, wild, and the kind of place where few people ventured without experience. That was part of the appeal. I wanted the challenge, the quiet, the chance to be completely alone except for the natural sounds of the forest. The trail was supposed to be around 25 miles one way, winding up steep hills and across narrow ridges. I planned to camp overnight near a small stream halfway through, then head back the next day. The first few hours were pleasant. The forest was thick with pine and oak, the ground carpeted with dry leaves and scattered pine needles. I followed the narrow path, stepping carefully over exposed roots and rocks. Birds called from high above, and every now and then, a squirrel would dart across the trail. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. It was peaceful. I kept a steady pace, my backpack snug but not too heavy. The sun rose higher, warming the air and bringing out the colors of the forest. Green leaves shimmered in the breeze, and occasional patches of wildflowers dotted the sides of the trail. I stopped briefly at a small clearing to drink water and eat a few nuts. My legs felt good, no aches yet. I checked my map and compass. Everything looked right. The trail was well marked with white blazes on the trees, easy to follow. After a while, the path began to climb steeply, switchbacking up a ridge. The footing was rougher here. Loose stones and fallen branches made every step a careful calculation. I paused several times, catching my breath and looking out over the valley below. The view was incredible. Rolling hills covered in endless forest, stretching far into the distance, with the blue haze of mountains beyond. As the afternoon wore on, the sun shifted west, casting long shadows between the trees. The temperature dropped, and I pulled on a light jacket. I had been careful to leave early so I wouldn't get caught on the trail after dark. The map showed a stream and a flat campsite about 8 miles in. That would be my stop for the night. I was eager to get there, set up camp, and rest. I crossed a few small creeks, stepping on slick stones, careful not to slip. At one point, I startled a deer, which bounded off into the woods, its white tail flashing. I felt a surge of excitement and calm. This was what I had come for, the wilderness, raw and real. But as the afternoon deepened, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and denser, their thick trunks closing in on the path. The air became cooler and damper. I noticed that the usual bird calls were fewer, replaced by an eerie silence. The crunch of my boots on the trail seemed unnaturally loud. A thin mist began to creep through the underbrush, curling around the trunks like smoke. I pushed on, my senses alert. The trail was getting harder to follow. Some of the white blazes were faded or missing. At a fork in the path, I hesitated. Both trails looked well worn, but the map indicated I should bear left. Still, the left trail seemed narrower and darker. Something in me wanted to take the right, which was wider and more open, but I forced myself to stick to the plan. After about an hour, the trail abruptly ended at a dense thicket of brambles and fallen trees. I crouched to inspect the ground, hoping I had missed a marker or a hidden turn. I looked back, but the path was gone behind me, swallowed by undergrowth. My heart quickened. I tried to calm myself. I reminded myself this was normal in backcountry hiking. Trails sometimes became faint or disrupted by storms or animal activity. I took out my map and compass. According to the compass, I was heading roughly east, but the map showed the stream should be slightly southeast. I adjusted my direction carefully, aiming to move toward the water. But after an hour of pushing through the thick forest, I found only more trees and rough terrain. I realized the trail must have been washed out or obscured. The sun was starting to dip below the ridges now. The mist was thicker. The forest felt colder, heavier. I tried not to panic, but my mouth went dry. I still had some water and food, but I knew I couldn't wander aimlessly all night. I pulled out my emergency whistle and blew it once. No answer. I checked my phone again, no signal as expected. I decided to backtrack, hoping to find the trail again at the fork. The undergrowth was cruel to move through, with thorny vines tearing at my jacket and branches scraping my face. My legs ached from climbing and pushing through. The light was fading fast. Just as I reached the fork again, the last light disappeared, swallowed by thick cloud cover. I flipped on my headlamp, the narrow beam cutting a pale circle in the darkness. The forest felt alive now, but not with animals. There was an almost oppressive stillness. The silence was deafening. I heard my own breathing, the rapid thumping of my heart. I followed the left trail again, hoping to find the campsite before it got too late. The trail was rough and narrow, sometimes covered with wet leaves and slick rocks. The air smelled of damp wood and decay. I kept walking, telling myself I would find the stream soon. Then I heard something. a faint rustling to my right, deeper in the shadows. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind, the trees were still. The sound was soft, deliberate, something moving slowly. I shined my headlamp toward the noise, but saw only dense brush. I moved on, faster now, trying to ignore the prickling feeling at the back of my neck. The forest seemed endless. I felt small and vulnerable. My legs were shaking. Then, abruptly, I stumbled onto a wide, rocky bank. The rushing sound of water filled my ears. I had found the stream. Relief flooded me, but also exhaustion. I dropped my pack, sat on a large boulder, and drank deep from my water bottle. I looked around for a flat spot to set up camp. The ground nearby was uneven and covered in leaves, but I managed to find a small clearing just off the bank, surrounded by tall pines. I pitched my tent slowly, hands trembling. Darkness had fully fallen now, and the only light was from my headlamp and the faint stars peeking through the canopy. I built a small fire with dry twigs and pine needles, the crackle and warmth a comfort against the chill. Sitting by the fire, I tried to calm my thoughts. I was safe, at least for the night. Tomorrow I would head back, retrace my steps carefully. I checked my map again. The trail back was the same one I had followed in. I resolved to move early, before the forest became a maze again. Sleep was difficult. The sounds of the night, the croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, kept me alert. I kept my multi-tool within reach just in case. I listened carefully for anything unusual, but no threats came close. Eventually, fatigue overcame fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke before dawn, the forest still cloaked in darkness. I packed up quietly, careful not to disturb the campsite. The fire was almost out, only glowing embers left. The air was damp and cold. I put on my jacket and double-checked my gear. The trail back was just as challenging. The forest was dense and the path was uneven. I kept my headlamp on for the first hour, stepping cautiously. I reminded myself to stay calm and focused. The fear from last night still lingered, but I pushed it aside. Around mid-morning, I heard a sudden crashing noise ahead. Something large was moving quickly through the undergrowth. I froze, heart hammering. The noise came closer, and then suddenly, a large black bear burst onto the trail about 30 feet ahead. It was massive, with thick fur and powerful legs. It didn't seem aggressive, just startled. It stopped, sniffed the air, and then turned and disappeared into the forest. I exhaled slowly, relief flooding in. I had been prepared for this possibility, had bear spray in my pack but hadn't wanted to use it. I moved on carefully, more alert now than ever. Hours later, the forest began to thin and the trail became wider. I recognized the familiar markers from the morning. Soon, I was back at the trailhead, the sun shining brightly now and the sounds of cars and other hikers filling the air. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The hike had tested me in ways I hadn't expected. The lost trail, the cold night, I had planned the trip for weeks. The weather forecast was good, the trail map downloaded, gear packed with care. I set out early on a cool morning, the kind of morning where the air feels crisp but not cold, and the light still soft. The forest seemed quiet as I parked at the trailhead. I was alone, just me and the wilderness for 3 days. The trail started easy enough, a well-worn dirt path weaving through tall pine trees. Needles crunched softly underfoot. Every breath filled my lungs with the smell of damp earth and pine resin. Birds chirped unseen in the canopy above, and I felt a calm wash over me, like the forest was welcoming me in. After a couple of hours, the trail began to climb. The gentle slope became steeper and rougher, roots and rocks jutting up. I had to watch my step carefully. I could hear the steady rhythm of my breathing, a bit heavier now, mixed with the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves. I stopped at a small clearing to rest and drink water. The sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, casting dancing shadows. Around me, the forest felt alive. Buzzing insects, a rustle in the underbrush, the distant call of a woodpecker. I refilled my water bottle at a trickling stream nearby, careful not to drink directly, filtering the water first. The cold stream felt fresh in my hands. Packing up, I noticed the wind had picked up. Leaves stirred, and branches creaked. A faint chill ran down my neck. I shrugged it off and kept moving. By midday, the trail leveled out and crossed a ridge. From here, the view opened up to the valley below. Patches of green and brown, rivers snaking through, and the sky a wide, empty blue. I took out my camera and snapped some photos, trying to capture the vastness. I pressed on toward the designated campsite marked on my map, a spot near a lake a few miles ahead. I knew I had to keep pace if I wanted to reach it before nightfall. The trail narrowed as I descended toward the water, twisting through thicker brush and denser trees. Around mid-afternoon, something felt off. The forest seemed quieter, the birds gone silent. The air grew heavy, almost oppressive. I shook my head, trying not to let my imagination run wild. I reminded myself this was nature, nothing more. The path grew muddy after a recent rainstorm. My boots slipped in the slick earth. I slowed, watching every step. The trees closed in, branches scraping at my jacket. I reached the lake just as the sun dipped lower. The water was still and dark, reflecting the deepening sky. I set up my tent on a flat patch nearby, careful to clear sticks and rocks. That night, the forest was alive with sounds. The chirp of crickets, the rustling of leaves, distant calls of animals I couldn't see. I lay awake for a long time, listening. Sometimes I heard heavy footsteps off the trail, but when I strained my ears, nothing was there. On the second day, I woke early to a dense fog hanging over the lake. Everything was muted and gray. I ate a simple breakfast and packed up. The trail back was different. The fog clung to the trees, thickening as I walked. I lost sight of the path several times, having to rely on the compass and my map. My boots were heavier with mud, and the chill seeped through my jacket. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless, the same trees looping around me like a maze. I felt a creeping unease. My water supply was running low. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled onto a small clearing with an old campsite. Ash in a fire pit, rusted cans. Someone else had been here recently, but there was no sign of people. I took a moment to rest. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. I felt eyes on me, but no one was there. Pushing onward, I realized the trail markers I'd been following were missing or faded. I tried to backtrack to the last known marker but got turned around in the fog. My heart pounded. I stopped to think. I checked my map and compass repeatedly. The sun was setting, but in the fog, the light was weak. I made the decision to keep moving downhill, hoping to reach the parking area or a road. The forest grew denser. Muddy patches turned to slippery slopes. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree root, scraping my palms. Night fell quicker than expected. I fumbled in my pack for the flashlight. Its beam cut through the fog, revealing twisted branches and deep shadows. I realized I was lost. Fear tightened in my chest. I forced myself to keep calm. I decided to follow a small creek downhill, reasoning it would lead to a larger body of water or road. Hours passed in cold darkness. The creek gurgled beside me, and my boots sank deep into the mud. Suddenly, a rustle in the bushes ahead froze me. Something moved quickly, a large animal or maybe a person. I didn't know. My flashlight flickered as my hand shook. I stood still, holding my breath. The rustling stopped. After a tense moment, silence. I hurried on, heart hammering. Eventually, I saw a faint glow ahead. At first, I thought it was moonlight on the water, but then I realized it was the soft shine of a distant cabin window. I shouted, hoping someone was inside, but my voice sounded strange in the stillness. I approached cautiously. The cabin was small and old, but the lights were on. No one came to the door. I noticed a truck parked outside, empty. I waited by the porch for a while, then decided I couldn't rely on this. I had to keep moving. The fog started lifting a bit with the late night breeze. I used my compass to head east, aiming for the main road shown on my map. Finally, Just before dawn, the trail opened up to a dirt road. I followed it and, after an hour of walking, saw headlights. I waved frantically. The car slowed and stopped. A couple offered me a ride to the nearest town. Exhausted and soaked with mud, I accepted gratefully. Back in town, safe and warm, I realized how close I had come to real danger. The wilderness was beautiful but merciless. I learned the hard way that preparation isn't just about packing gear or reading maps. It's about respect, attention, and knowing when to turn back. From that trip on, I never took the forest for granted again. I had planned this hike for weeks. I was eager to escape the noise of the city and find some peace alone in the mountains. The trail I chose was a lesser-known ridge trail in the National Forest, about 6 miles in, winding along a narrow crest with steep drops on either side. I packed my backpack the night before, extra food, water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone, though I didn't expect to have any signal out there. I wore sturdy boots and my best hiking clothes, ready for the unpredictable weather. The morning started clear and cool. The sun was just climbing above the trees when I began the hike. The air smelled fresh and piney. Birds chirped softly in the branches. The trail was narrow but well-marked, with orange ribbons tied around branches at regular intervals. I kept a steady pace, feeling good and strong. The forest was quiet except for the small sounds of wildlife and my footsteps crunching on dried leaves and twigs. The path twisted and climbed gradually, opening up now and then to reveal wide views of rolling hills and distant mountains. I took photos here and there, stopping to admire wildflowers growing along the rocks and a small stream where I refilled my water bottle. Time slipped away as I focused on the rhythm of the hike and the beauty around me. After a few hours, the trail started to narrow and climb more steeply, the forest thinning to stunted pines and scrubby bushes. I was nearing the ridge now where the views would be best. The wind picked up, cool and sharp. Then something felt wrong. The path ahead was less clear. I spotted fewer ribbons. I checked my phone's GPS. No signal, as expected, but the map offline showed the trail continuing straight along the ridge. I followed it, but the trail started to look less worn. The ground was rougher, the rocks bigger, and the vegetation thicker. I thought maybe the trail was just less used here. After about 30 minutes, I reached a rocky outcrop that overlooked a deep valley. I stopped to rest and took out my water. That's when I realized I had no clear idea of where I was. The map showed a small clearing just ahead, but I couldn't see it from where I was. I decided to keep going, figuring I'd find the clearing and then the trail would be obvious again. The wind got stronger, whipping around the rocks and trees. Dark clouds began to gather above. I felt a chill creep over me, but I pushed on, trying to stay calm and keep my bearings. Then I heard it, a faint noise, like a low rustling or cracking, coming from below the ridge. It was too rhythmic to be wind, too soft to be an animal moving through the brush. I stopped, listened carefully, but the sound faded as the wind picked up. I shrugged it off and moved forward. The path was getting harder to follow. Some of the ribbons I saw earlier were gone or torn. I felt uneasy. I glanced behind me. The trail I had just come from was obscured by thick brush. I stepped carefully over loose rocks and roots, looking for any signs of the path. Suddenly, I realized I hadn't seen a single other hiker all day, which felt strange for a popular trail. My pace slowed. The wind was cold now, and the clouds thick enough to blot out the sun. I stopped to check my phone again. No signal. The GPS still showed me near the ridge, but no clear marker of the trail. Panic began to build. I tried to recall my steps. When had the path started to disappear? Had I taken a wrong turn? I remembered seeing a fork about an hour ago, but had followed what I thought was the main trail to the left. Maybe that was a mistake. The wind grew louder, whipping branches and sending leaves swirling. The temperature dropped quickly. I pulled my jacket tighter and pressed on, hoping to find shelter or a recognizable landmark. As I rounded a bend in the ridge, the ground beneath me gave way slightly. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree, and looked down. The slope was steep and rocky, dropping sharply on both sides. One false step here could mean a dangerous fall. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The sky had turned a dark gray, and the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy. I realized I wasn't prepared for a storm on this exposed ridge. I had to find a safer spot, but I didn't know which way to go. The trail had vanished. The ribbons were gone. My heart pounded. I pulled out my compass, the one thing I hadn't checked yet. I knew the general direction back to the trailhead was south. I turned and started moving carefully down the ridge, keeping close to the rocky slope to avoid slipping. The rain was falling harder now, soaking my clothes and making the rocks slick. The wind howled, pushing me sideways. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something ahead, a fallen tree forming a rough shelter against the wind. I hurried toward it, crouching beneath the branches and trying to catch my breath. My hands trembled. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing. I sat down, cold and wet, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The storm was worse now. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I realized I was stranded, alone on a ridge with no clear way back, no phone signal, and a storm closing in. I thought about my options. Staying put was dangerous, but moving in the dark and rain could be worse. I ate a small snack and drank some water, trying to keep my energy up. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think clearly. As the rain eased to a drizzle, I decided to move again, staying low and slow. I kept the compass pointing south, hoping to find the trail or a break in the trees. The ground was slippery, and my boots struggled for grip. Every step was a test of balance and courage. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. A figure crouched near the rocks, partially hidden by the brush. My heart stopped. I froze, trying to make out who or what it was. It was a man, dirty and ragged, with wild eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared. For a moment, I thought about running, but the terrain was too dangerous. The wind pushed us both silently. I remembered stories I'd heard about people who lived off the grid in the mountains, some harmless, some not. I stayed calm, not wanting to provoke him. He motioned slowly toward a narrow path that led down from the ridge. I took a chance and followed, hoping it was the right way down. The path was steep and rocky, but I kept my focus on my footing. The man stayed behind, watching but not following. After what felt like hours, the trees thickened, and the slope eased. The rain stopped. I heard the faint sound of running water, a stream. I followed it downhill, knowing streams often lead to trails or roads. Finally, just as the sun began to rise, I spotted a dirt road in the distance. I ran toward it, calling out, hoping someone was there. A few minutes later, a truck drove by, and I flagged it down. The driver was a local ranger. I told him what happened, and he radioed for help. They found the trail where I had lost it, marked it better, and warned hikers about the dangers of the ridge in bad weather. I was exhausted, soaked, and scared, but I was safe. The whole experience left me shaken, knowing how quickly things can turn bad in the wilderness, how easy it is to get lost, and how alone you can be out there. From that day on, I never took the mountains for granted. I learned to prepare better, respect the power of nature, and most importantly, to always pay attention to the small signs. The ridge trail still calls to me sometimes, but now with a healthy dose of caution and respect. It was late September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in Montana. I'd spent most of the summer working overtime hours at a small construction company in Idaho Falls, and I hadn't taken a single day off. The work was wearing me down mentally and physically. I'd started snapping at people over small things. My back hurt all the time. My sleep was broken. I needed to get away from everything for a while, and hiking had always helped me clear my head. The forests, the isolation, the rhythm of walking, it always helped me reset. So I picked a spot on the map, packed my gear, and drove up north toward a place I hadn't been before, the Centennial Mountains near the Montana-Idaho border. The plan was to hike up through Hell Roaring Creek Trail, then bushwhack my way up into the foothills and follow an old game trail that wrapped around the east side of the ridge. I'd found it on a hunter's forum. Someone had posted about how elk like to gather near a series of high meadows up there. It wasn't a maintained trail, but I had topographic maps, a GPS, and my compass. I knew how to navigate. I was only planning to be out there for 3 days, maybe 4. I brought enough supplies for 5 just in case. I parked my truck in a pull-off near the trailhead just after sunrise. The sky was clear and cold. I shouldered my pack, checked the straps, and started off down the path. The first few miles were quiet and peaceful. I passed a couple of small creeks and watched a hawk circle overhead. The wind moved through the trees in soft waves. The forest here felt older than the places I'd hiked before. The trees were taller, denser. The undergrowth was thick, and I had to duck under branches and climb over fallen logs more often than usual. But it was beautiful. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, and that was just what I wanted. Complete quiet. About 6 hours in, I left the marked trail and started following the contour line toward where the game trail was supposed to be. The slope got steeper and the going was slower. I stopped to eat a granola bar near a small boulder field and noticed fresh scat nearby. Elk, possibly moose. I saw tracks too. I figured I was heading in the right direction. An hour later, I found the trail. It wasn't much. A narrow groove in the earth, barely visible between the grass and moss. But it was there. I followed it for another mile until I reached a flat clearing just above the tree line. I set up camp there for the night. The view was incredible. I could see the sun starting to set behind the ridge, and the sky was orange and purple. I boiled some water, made a freeze-dried pasta meal, and watched the stars come out one by one. The air was crisp. I zipped up my sleeping bag, lay back in my tent, and felt better than I had in months. The next morning, I packed up and followed the trail further up into the hills. I wanted to see the high meadows the hunter had talked about. If I could make it there by noon, I'd have time to explore and maybe find a good spot to sit and watch for wildlife. I wasn't hunting, but I liked watching elk if I could find them. Something about their size, their silence, it always amazed me. The game trail kept climbing. I had to push through thick patches of brush and squeeze through narrow gaps between trees. The higher I got, the windier it became. I started to notice things felt a little off, subtle at first. I hadn't seen any animals since early that morning. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just silence. And then I started finding the bones. The first was a spine. Just a clean spine with the rib cage attached, lying half hidden in the brush beside the trail. It looked like it had been picked clean. I crouched next to it and looked closer. No fur, no hide, no meat, just bone. And it was white, dry. Not fresh, but not old either. I kept going. A few minutes later, I found a partial skull. Maybe elk, maybe moose. It was cracked down the center and missing the jaw. Then more bones. A femur, part of a pelvis. Scattered, not in a full skeleton. Just pieces. Then I found a full elk carcass. It was lying on its side in a shallow ditch next to a patch of willows. Its body had been ripped open along the belly, and its insides were missing. Its legs were twisted at unnatural angles. The eyes were gone, and the tongue was missing. It didn't smell yet. The blood around the wound was dark, almost dry. Couldn't have been more than 24 hours old. I looked around the area but didn't see any signs of a struggle. No broken branches, no drag marks, no tracks in the mud. No predator scat either. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. Something about the way it was lying there felt wrong. I've seen animals killed by bears before. I've even come across wolves' kills during the winter, but this didn't look like that. It looked cleaner, neater, like something had opened the elk up and taken what it wanted, then left the rest behind. But what predator does that? I almost turned back right then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself it was probably a bear. Maybe a very large cat, maybe even hunters who butchered it and left the rest. But the lack of mess didn't make sense. Still, I didn't want to feel like I'd wasted the hike. I told myself I'd just go a little further, just get to the meadow and head back. So I kept going. The trail narrowed and dropped into a shallow ravine. The trees thinned out and gave way to scrub grass and moss-covered rocks. I followed the trail until it opened up into a wide field that stretched out beneath a long ridgeline. The meadow was golden in the sunlight, tall grass swaying in the wind. It would have been beautiful if I hadn't already been so on edge. There were more carcasses, 3 more elk, two lying close to each other near the center of the field, the third at the far end near a stand of trees. All of them had the same wound, ripped open along the belly, insides removed, eyes gone, limbs twisted. No bugs, no scavengers, no smell, just silence. I walked up to the closest one and crouched down. I checked for tags or collars, nothing. It looked just like the first. Dry blood, no footprints around it, no tracks leading in or out. The hair on my arms was standing up. I turned around to leave, and that's when I saw the first sign that I wasn't alone. On a patch of bare dirt near the edge of the meadow, there were boot prints. Not hiking boots like mine, thinner like work boots, big, deep, someone heavy. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I counted at least 5 prints before they disappeared into the grass. I scanned the ridge. Nothing. No movement. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I moved fast. I turned around, followed the game trail back toward the ravine, and kept walking without stopping. I didn't want to be there anymore. Every sound made me twitch. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like someone walking behind me. About a mile back down the trail, I stopped for water. I crouched beside a boulder and pulled out my bottle. That's when I saw something that made my stomach sink. Another carcass, but this one was different. It wasn't an animal. It was a dog. A large one, maybe a German Shepherd or similar. Torn open the same way, gutted, eyes gone, no collar. And near it, half buried in the dirt, was a small pile of gear. A torn sleeping bag, an old backpack, a rusted camp stove. It looked like someone had set up camp and never left. I didn't waste any more time. I started moving downhill as fast as I could without falling. My legs were shaking. I didn't stop to check the map. I just followed the same line back the way I came. Somewhere near where I'd camped the night before, I heard a sound. A single sharp crack like a branch snapping underfoot. Then silence. I stood completely still, trying to listen. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no bugs. Just complete, suffocating quiet. I don't know why I didn't run. I think part of me thought that if I ran, whatever it was would follow. So I just kept walking, steady pace, not stopping for anything. It started getting dark. I kept going. My legs were cramping. My knees hurt. I didn't care. At some point, I veered off course. I didn't realize it until I checked my GPS and saw I was a full mile east of where I thought I was. The trail had vanished. I was walking through thick underbrush trying to find my bearings. My battery was down to 9%. I had a map and compass, but the light was fading. I found a small hollow between 2 ridges and decided to stop there for the night. I didn't set up my tent. I just lay down in my sleeping bag behind a large rock and tried to stay quiet. I didn't sleep. I heard movement in the trees several times. Small steps, slow, careful. Not a bear, not a moose, something on 2 legs. Once, just before dawn, I heard breathing, not my own. Slow, steady, just beyond the rock. I didn't move. Eventually, the sun came up and the sound stopped. When it was light enough, I started walking again. I didn't stop for anything. No food, just water. 7 hours later, I reached my truck. There was a scratch down the driver's side door. Long, deep, like someone had dragged a knife along the paint. I drove straight to the nearest gas station. Started with me just needing to clear my head. Work had been heavy, life had been noisy, and I hadn't felt like myself in months. I thought a long solo hiking trip would be the reset I needed. I'd done a few 2 or 3 day hikes before, but this time I planned to go deeper, 5 full days in the Rocky Mountains, on a trail I picked specifically for how remote it was. No cell service, no people, no noise, just me, nature, and the weight of my pack. I left my car at a small trailhead parking lot early on a Monday morning. There were only 2 other vehicles there, both covered in dust like they hadn't moved in a few days. That was perfect for me. I noted where the ranger station was just in case, then shouldered my pack and headed out. The first day was peaceful. Quiet forest, slow, steady climbs, pine needles under my boots, and the occasional crunch of loose gravel. I saw a deer early in the day, a few squirrels, and plenty of birds. The air was crisp and dry, the way I liked it, and there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. I hiked about 12 miles before making camp near a small creek. I filtered water, boiled it, and made a quick meal. Then I sat back against a log and just listened. That was what I came for, pure stillness, the kind you can't find anywhere else. The second day was more of the same, but I went deeper into the backcountry. The trail narrowed and became rockier, with longer stretches between water sources. I was glad I'd brought enough water bottles and a filter. My GPS watch helped me track where I was, though I knew once the battery died, I'd have to rely on my map and compass. I was okay with that. I liked old-school tools. I saw fewer signs of people the deeper I went. Some faded footprints in a patch of mud, a broken trekking pole tip stuck in a crack of a rock, and an old fire ring that had long since gone cold. It made me feel like I was really out there, away from everything. That night, I camped just below tree line, where the wind came through colder and harder. I bundled up, secured my food far from the tent, and fell asleep to the sound of wind snapping through the pines. Things started to shift on the third day. I'd planned to hike a long stretch that would bring me to a lake another 12 miles out. According to the map, there'd be a small open clearing to pass through after a long ridgeline. The climb was hard, loose rock and narrow switchbacks, but I was still in good spirits. That changed just before noon. I came across something strange on the trail. At first, I thought it was trash, just a black object lying by the edge of the path. But when I got closer, I saw it was a hiking boot, just one, weather-beaten but not old. The laces were still tied. It was upright, like someone had just stepped out of it. I looked around, confused. I expected to see another boot, or a backpack maybe, or signs someone had stopped for a break. But there was nothing, just the boot. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart picking up a little. Maybe someone lost it by accident. Maybe they carried the other one off. Maybe it was nothing. Still, I didn't like it. I took a photo just in case, marked the GPS location on my watch, and moved on. I couldn't stop thinking about the boot. A mile later, I noticed something else, drag marks. Not big, but definite. Scratches in the dirt and gravel that didn't look natural, like something heavy had been pulled off the trail. The marks vanished into the underbrush, leading downhill. I stood frozen for a while. No animal tracks, no blood, no other gear. Just those lines in the dirt, like someone had been dragged. My stomach felt tight, but I forced myself to move. I told myself maybe it was a deer that had gotten injured, or a bear dragging something it killed. I didn't believe that, but I had to tell myself something. That night, I didn't make it to the lake. I stopped short and made camp on a small ledge above the main trail. I was tired, but more than that, I was uneasy. I kept hearing things. Not loud, just little sounds. A twig snapping, something rustling leaves. I sat inside the tent with my headlamp on low, bear spray in my hand, listening for hours. I barely slept. The next morning, I thought about turning back, but I was already more than halfway into the loop. Going back would take longer than finishing the trail. I told myself I was just spooked. Maybe I was imagining things. I'd always had an active mind, so I kept going. The terrain got rougher, rockier, and more exposed. No trees, no shelter. The wind picked up hard and steady, and the clouds started to build. I checked my map and compass again and again. I wanted to make it over the pass before weather hit. I didn't make it. Around noon, the storm rolled in fast. Not just rain, hail, and hard wind. Visibility dropped, and I had to crouch beside a rock outcrop for shelter. The temperature dropped sharply. I threw on all my warm layers and stayed low for almost an hour, waiting for the worst to pass. When it did, the trail was soaked and slick. I moved slow, placing every step carefully. That's when I found the second boot. This one was different. It wasn't upright. It was half buried in mud, the top torn open like something had slashed it. The sole was hanging by threads. It didn't look old. It looked ripped. I just stared at it for a long time, and then I heard something. It was faint, far behind me, down the trail I'd come from. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but it wasn't. It was a thud. then another, like something hitting the ground. Heavy, steady, getting closer. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I pushed on. I hiked for hours without stopping, my legs burning. The trail cut through a narrow gulch, and I moved fast until I reached the lake I was supposed to get to the night before. But something in me didn't want to stop. I was beyond tired, but I didn't want to camp there. Not with whatever that was behind me. I went a mile farther and finally found a flat patch among the trees. I set up camp in silence, didn't cook, didn't even change out of my wet clothes. I just crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep again. Around midnight, I heard crunching outside the tent. Not footsteps, heavier, slower, measured, like something walking around the perimeter. I didn't move. I held my breath and stayed as still as I could. The noise circled twice. Then it stopped. Nothing. Total silence. For hours. When morning came, I packed as fast as I ever have in my life. The ground outside was damp and torn in places. Scrapes in the soil, patches of moss pulled up, but no clear footprints. I was done. I didn't care about finishing the loop. I plotted the shortest way back to the car and went for it. That final day was the longest of my life. I kept checking behind me, hearing things, seeing shapes move just past my line of sight. Nothing clear, nothing I could point to, but the sense of being followed never went away. It stayed with me until the trail widened and I saw the roof of the ranger station through the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't even go inside. I went straight to my car and drove out of there without a second thought. Later that night, back at home, I looked up any news I could about the area. I didn't find anything current, but I did find a 2-year-old missing hiker report. A solo backpacker named Ryan who vanished in the same area I just hiked through. His last known location was near the same ridgeline where I saw the first boot. His body was never found. I contacted the local ranger station and gave them the GPS coordinates where I'd seen the boots and the marks. They said they'd send someone to check it out. That was 3 months ago. I still haven't heard back. I still think about that sound, those steady thuds in the mud, and the way the tent fabric shook that night without a breeze in the air. I don't know what it was out there or who, but I know it wasn't an animal. I know something was watching me, and I know I'll never go hiking alone again. I left the trailhead just after 7 o'clock in the morning. The weather was perfect, cool, quiet, and still. It was the kind of morning I always looked forward to when planning hikes. I had packed everything the night before. Food, extra water, a compass, map, portable charger, first aid kit, knife, headlamp, and even an emergency blanket. I had checked everything off twice. I always did that. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't some kind of wilderness expert either. I just liked getting out there alone. The trail was part of a larger national forest area. It wasn't a tourist-heavy location, which I liked. There were trail markers, but they weren't maintained like the ones in bigger parks. It meant fewer people and more quiet. I had parked my car in the gravel lot and locked everything up. The hike I was doing was supposed to loop around and bring me back to the same spot by evening. About 18 miles total. I knew the terrain and studied the topography before setting out. The first part was just gentle elevation, and it would get steeper around midday. I'd planned to have lunch around the halfway point, where there was a small creek. I figured I'd refill my water there using the filter I brought. For the first few hours, everything was great. The trail cut through thick woods. Sunlight filtered in patches through the canopy. The sound of birds, the wind through the trees. It all made me feel calm. The world felt far away. I took slow steps, kept a steady rhythm, and tried not to overthink. Just walk, breathe, watch. A few times I stopped to take photos or adjust my pack, but I kept moving. Around 11 o'clock, I came across a part of the trail that had a fallen tree across it. Not unusual. I stepped over it and kept going. But soon after, I noticed the trail markers were harder to find. I slowed down and checked the map. I thought I was still on the right path. The terrain matched the topographic lines, mostly uphill, some rocks, no major forks in the trail. I kept walking, trying not to overthink it. Then I came to a fork I wasn't expecting. There was no marker, no sign, nothing. Just a clear path splitting in two directions, left and right. I pulled out the map again. I turned it over, oriented it north. Neither trail was listed there. That confused me. I thought maybe I had wandered off the official trail without realizing it. Maybe the trail had been rerouted, or maybe it was an old logging road. I wasn't sure. I chose the right path because it looked slightly more used. There were faint boot prints in the dirt. Maybe someone had gone that way earlier. I followed it for about 15 minutes, and that's when things started to feel off. The trail narrowed almost to the point where I had to step through bushes. Spider webs clung to my face. There were no more signs of foot traffic, and the terrain started to slope downward, which didn't match the map at all. The forest grew denser too, darker, even though it was still daytime. I stopped and checked the GPS app on my phone. No signal. That didn't surprise me out here. I tried to backtrack, but after a few minutes of walking back, nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees were dense. I couldn't even see the sky through them in most places. Everything looked the same. I couldn't remember the last marker I'd seen. I decided to keep moving in one direction instead of wasting time going in circles. I figured if I headed downhill, I'd eventually find a stream or a road. The forest had to give way to something eventually. I kept walking, trying to mark trees with little cuts from my knife so I wouldn't double back. It was slow going. My shirt got torn from a branch. A thorn tore the skin on my forearm. Nothing serious, but it stung. It was after 2 o'clock when I realized I was officially lost. I hadn't seen a person all day. I hadn't heard any sounds from planes, cars, or people. I was alone in a dense patch of forest that didn't match anything on my map. I sat on a rock, drank water, and ate some trail mix. I told myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. I tried to retrace where I might have gone wrong. That unmarked fork. I never should have taken it. Maybe if I just headed back far enough. But after another hour of walking, I hit a patch of thick underbrush that I didn't remember passing earlier. I must have turned at some point without realizing it. That's when I made a choice that probably saved my life later. I stopped trying to find the original trail. I decided instead to just head downhill as much as possible. The land would eventually lead to water, and water usually leads to people. But that meant going off-trail completely. No paths, no markers, just instinct. The trees got thicker, and every step became a challenge. I had to duck under branches, climb over fallen logs, push through brush. My legs got scratched. My arms ached. I was sweating heavily. I felt the first signs of dehydration. I took small sips from my bottle and saved the rest. The filter would only help if I found water. By 4 o'clock, the light started to change. It wasn't dark yet, but in the woods, shadows come early. I started looking for a place to stop for the night. I had packed an emergency bivy sack. Not comfortable, but it would do. I found a small clearing near a cluster of boulders. I cleared the ground of sticks and leaves and settled in. I ate a protein bar, drank a little water, and wrapped myself up as best I could. That night was long. Cold crept in from the ground. I shivered off and on. I heard noises, twigs snapping, movement in the brush. Animals, probably, but every sound felt like a threat. I kept the knife in my hand inside the sleeping bag. I barely slept. Maybe an hour or two broken into fragments. When the light finally returned, I packed up quickly and started downhill again. My legs were sore, my throat dry. I hadn't found water. I hadn't seen anything resembling a trail, but I kept moving. That's all I could do. Late that morning, I finally heard it, the faint sound of running water. It was soft, distant, but definitely real. I moved toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. Took over half an hour, but I found it. A narrow stream winding through the trees. I knelt by it, pulled out the filter, and drank. The water tasted like life. I filled both bottles, rested, and ate. Following the stream gave me hope. I walked alongside it for hours. Sometimes I had to climb over rocks or skirt around fallen trees, but I stayed close. I was certain it would lead to something. That afternoon, I found something else. A boot print in the mud. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't mine. Too wide, Too deep and fresh. Someone had come through here not long ago, maybe a few hours before. That meant I was close to some kind of trail or road. I felt my heart speed up. I followed the direction the print faced, staying close to the stream but looking for more signs. It was around 3 o'clock when I found the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map I'd seen. No signs, no road, just a weathered wooden structure with a small porch, sitting in a clearing near the stream. The windows were covered with shutters. The roof sagged slightly in one corner. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look lived in either. I walked around it slowly, cautious. I knocked, waited, knocked again. No response. I wasn't looking to break in, but I was desperate. I checked the door. It wasn't locked. I opened it and stepped inside. It was one room, a bed, a small stove, shelves, and a table with 2 chairs. Dust on everything, but not thick. There were canned goods on the shelf, some of them expired, some still good. A big water jug sat in the corner, nearly full. Someone had been here recently. Maybe a hunter, maybe a trapper. I didn't want to stay long, but I needed rest. I ate a can of beans cold, drank water, and sat for a while. I didn't touch anything else. I left a note on the table saying who I was, the date, and that I'd gotten lost, just in case someone came back and found it. Before I left, I checked behind the cabin and found what I'd hoped for. A narrow dirt road, overgrown but clearly used at some point. I followed it. Took hours. The road twisted, narrowed, then widened again. I saw old tire tracks. The sun was setting, and I didn't know how far it went, but I kept going. Just after sunset, I saw the first sign of civilization. A rusted metal gate with a chain on it. Beyond it, a gravel road. I squeezed through the side and kept walking. Half an hour later, headlights appeared in the distance. Pickup truck. I stepped out, waved both arms, and the driver stopped. I told him I'd gotten lost, that my car was at the trailhead. He didn't say much, just nodded and gave me a ride. We got back to the lot an hour later. My car was still there. I thanked him, got inside, and just sat there for a long time. It had only been 2 days. 2 days felt like a week. I had food, gear, and a plan, but it didn't stop things from going wrong. One wrong turn and I was off the map. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't found the stream, if I hadn't found that cabin. I don't know exactly why I chose that particular weekend to go hiking alone. I think I just needed to get away from everything. My job had been stressing me out, and I'd been spending too much time on screens. I missed fresh air, silence, and the kind of peace you only find when you're far from people. I'd been hiking solo before, but not often. I always preferred marked trails, popular areas, and places with cell service. This time, though, I wanted something quieter. I started looking at maps and read some forums. I picked a section of forested mountain out in central Idaho. The terrain looked steep and rough, but there were a few unofficial trails and old fire roads. Not a lot of traffic, but not completely off the radar either. That was enough for me. I packed light but smart. I brought my tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 4 days, a water filter, bear spray, a first aid kit, and a small emergency beacon. I always carried a map and compass, and I kept my phone charged even though I doubted I'd have service. I drove up Friday morning, parked near a dirt pull-off at the edge of the woods, locked my car, and started hiking around noon. The trail wasn't really a trail. It looked like it had once been a logging road or something, mostly overgrown, sometimes barely visible under tall grass and fallen branches. I followed it for miles, climbing steadily, crossing small creeks and steep ridges. The further I got, the more isolated it felt. No houses, no cabins, no fences, not even any old signs. Just trees, hills, and the occasional deer crashing through the brush. I reached a flat clearing around 5 in the evening and set up my tent. The air was cool and dry. I didn't see a single person all day. I cooked dinner on my little stove, ate quickly, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the sun went down. I felt good, calm, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night, I woke up once to some rustling near the tent. I lay still and listened. It sounded like a deer, maybe an elk, moving through the bushes nearby. Nothing too close. I gripped my bear spray just in case, but eventually drifted off again. I wasn't scared. Not yet. The next day, I packed up and kept moving higher into the mountains. The path got rougher. A few times I had to scramble over rocks or climb around fallen trees. I was sweating hard by mid-morning, but I liked it. The kind of challenge that felt good. I stopped to refill my water at a small stream, filtered it, and kept going. By afternoon, I'd made it to the edge of a long, narrow ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides. The view was amazing. Pine trees covered everything, stretching out for miles. No roads, no smoke, no cell towers, just wilderness. I found another flat patch a little below the ridge and decided to camp there. It was about a mile from a small alpine lake I'd seen on the map. I planned to visit the lake the next day before heading back down. After setting up camp and eating, I sat on a rock overlooking the valley and watched the sun drop below the tree line. Everything was quiet except for the occasional bird call or wind moving through the branches. But at some point, I started to feel a little uneasy. It was subtle, just a weird sensation that I wasn't alone. I looked around, saw nothing, and told myself I was just being paranoid. I went to bed early, planning to get an early start the next morning. That night was different. I woke up around midnight to a sound. Not rustling, not wind, something slower. A single footstep, then nothing, then another. I held my breath and listened. It was like someone was walking nearby, slow, cautious steps through dry grass and pine needles. I sat up in my sleeping bag and quietly reached for my bear spray. My heart was pounding. The steps stopped. I stayed completely still. I couldn't hear breathing or any movement after that. Just silence. Eventually, after maybe 10 minutes, I convinced myself it could have been an animal. A bear? Maybe. But the steps had sounded more like a person. 2 feet. Deliberate. Not the clumsy shuffle of something on 4 legs. Still, I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. I kept the spray in my hand and stayed alert, but I didn't get up. At some point, I must have drifted off again. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks. No signs of anyone or anything coming close. I ate a cold breakfast, skipped my plan to go to the lake, and started hiking back the way I came. I wasn't scared exactly, just alert. I didn't like that feeling of being watched, and I figured it was better to move out of that area. I was about halfway back to the first night's clearing when I noticed something strange. On the side of the trail, maybe 30 feet off, there was a tree with stripped bark about 5 or 6 feet up. Clean scratches, deep ones, almost like claw marks, but too wide for a cougar. Too organized to be random. I stopped and stared at them. My stomach dropped. I'd read about bears marking trees, but these didn't look like that. They looked fresh too. The exposed wood hadn't even darkened yet. It felt like someone had carved them that morning. I picked up the pace after that. I stopped taking breaks and kept checking behind me. Nothing was there. At least nothing I could see. When I reached the first clearing again, the place I'd camped the first night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a boot print, human, right where my tent had been. It wasn't mine. My boots had a unique sole pattern with a circle near the heel. This one was different, longer, wider, and flatter. I crouched and stared at it for a long time. It hadn't rained, so it could have been from the same night I stayed there. But why was it so close to my tent? I stood up slowly and looked around. No one, no sound, just the breeze moving through the trees. That's when I knew with complete certainty that someone was out there, and they were watching me. I didn't set up camp that night. I kept walking well into the evening, using my headlamp once it got dark. I didn't want to stop. I just wanted to put distance between me and whoever had been following me. I finally stopped on a slope between 2 ridges. Not a great spot, but better than nothing. I didn't set up the tent. I just rolled out my bag behind a large boulder and lay there, staring up at the sky. I didn't sleep. All night I listened. At one point I heard something far off. A stick breaking, then another, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. I gripped my bear spray with one hand and my flashlight in the other. The noises didn't come closer, but they didn't go away either. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew someone was out there, somewhere walking in circles, staying just far enough away to avoid being seen. I waited until first light before packing up and getting out of there as fast as I could. My legs ached. I hadn't eaten. I didn't care. I just kept going. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I saw a faint sign of the dirt road I had driven in on. I practically ran the last half mile. When I saw my car, still parked where I left it, I almost cried. I threw everything into the trunk, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there. No one followed me, at least not that I could see. But I didn't feel safe until I hit the highway an hour later. When I got home, I took a long shower and sat in silence for hours. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't report it. What could I say? That I felt like someone was following me? That I heard footsteps and saw a boot print? I had no proof. Nothing really happened, except it did. The worst part is, I'll never know who it was. A hunter? A hermit? Someone out there living off-grid who didn't like me in their space? Or something worse? I haven't gone hiking since. I still go outside. I still camp sometimes with friends in crowded places where there are other people and cell towers nearby. But I'll never hike alone again. Not in a place that remote. I learned something out there. Nature is beautiful, but it isn't empty. Just because you don't see anyone doesn't mean you're alone. And if someone decides to follow you and they're patient and careful and quiet, you might never even know they were there. But I knew, and I still think about it, especially at night, when the world gets quiet and I start hearing things in the silence. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left early. If I'd stayed one more night by that lake. If I'd waited long enough for whoever it was to finally come closer. But I didn't, and I'm still here. That has to count for something.